To look forward, one must first look back, is how you might try to open one of these if you were going to try and hide the fact that you're doing an epic compilation, quasi-documentary retrospective of your past material because the algorithm rewards the length of engagement now and it's not exactly getting less expensive to get by in this fucking world. And since I'm not trying to hide any of that, well, here we are. The fact of the matter is, as we close in on the release of The Flash, an entire movie that was technically greenlit almost a decade ago to be part of the beginning of a cinematic universe branding exercise and is now being released as having transmogrified into a way to officially declare said branding exercise a complete failure so that a new branding exercise may begin, it occurs to me that I have spent, in fact, not insubstantial part of my career in internet film criticism chronicling this slow-motion disaster of what will soon have been formerly known as the DC Extended Universe. The stretch of time from the release of Man of Steel in 2013 to this very moment encompassed for me 2 terms of employment with a website called The Escapist, the loss and reacquisition of the big picture as a brand and series of my own, stints with channels like ScrewAttack and Geek.com, my current gig as a writer for Theorist, the launch of my Patreon-supported indie channel here, 3 American presidential administrations, a global plague, pretty much the entire concurrent first 3 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which DC's project was always a reactionary response to, and dozens of other pop culture adjacent factors, but of course, specifically, it encompasses the story of Hollywood and the art of mainstream movie making at an inflection point, a sprawling, hard to believe, but for the fact that we all watched it happen, saga, at once comical and infuriating and deeply, deeply sad of how hubris, greed, mismanagement, misunderstanding, chasing trends while failing to grasp what made them, and the demonic influence of the sunk cost fallacy turning a sure thing into a decade-long garbage fire that eventually burned down one of the last great studios of the Golden Age. Going back over my material looking for ways to summarize it all effectively proved to me that it just wasn't enough to summarize it. There was so much that I'd forgotten, and also so many repeating threads and now coherent narratives to the story of the thing that it just felt right to try and share the experience of re-experiencing it with you, the audience, if not completely, then as completely as might still be somewhat entertaining, and also hopefully monetization friendly for the channel, which is why there's going to be plenty of edits and filtering just to get that out ahead of time. So, what I'm presenting you with here is the first of collections of my video essays covering the DCEU disaster and the collapse of Warner Brothers in chronological order. Reviews, previews, episodes of The Big Picture, In Bob We Trust, various other things, sourced as available and grouped to theme and time with contextual commentary by me, chapter style. I hope you find it entertaining, or at least don't feel as progressively old as I did putting it together. So let us begin. So what you're going to see right here first is 3 episodes of The Big Picture and the original Man of Steel review, all produced around 2013, 2014, basically concurrent with the release of that movie and covering the lead up to the release, the actual, hey, here's what I thought of Man of Steel immediately after seeing it the first time, and then a reconsideration in the context of the very, very rapid onset of, wow, yeah, that really wasn't very good, was it? That kind of settled over a lot of us in the film critic community, myself included, as that year went on. Right in the middle, there's also an additional Big Picture episode produced on the subject of Ben Affleck playing Batman when that was announced, and, you know, in context is just fascinating to look back on and remember that as a culture, not that long ago at that time, that was considered the weird, risky, I don't know, will he take it seriously enough thing that all the Batman fanboys were bent out of shape about these movies. Oh, and once again, I'm going to try not to have to say this every time, but the point of this whole thing is historic context and overview, so I'm not trying to present most of these without too much in the way of cutting until we get to the semi-unscripted ones from more recently, where it's in the interest of just getting to the fucking point. But I do ask people to please bear in mind, especially early on, a lot of these episodes and reviews are from literally a decade ago. A lot has happened in the interim, including a plague, and I'd like to think that those of us who survived are all pretty different, hopefully better people now. So no, I don't agree or endorse with every single stupid opinion that I had at the time, or what past me necessarily said about movies, pop culture, or anything. Where it might be especially egregious, I'll try to point it out, but you know, if you're gonna see some things change over time, strap in for that. Anyway. Man of Steel opens in the United States later this week. Depending on when you're watching this episode of The Big Picture, I'll very likely have already seen it, but as of this recording, I have not. Consider my fingers crossed. Actually, consider a lot of people's fingers crossed. As befits him, this new incarnation of Superman is carrying a lot of weight on its shoulders, not only undertaking the somehow necessary task of making the most towering figure in the currently biggest genre in all of popular culture cool again, but also helping Warner Bros. DC Comics movie adaptations finally move out of the Gotham City ghetto, stop embarrassing themselves, and just generally get their act together. I mean, seriously, just the fact that the Avengers got to movie theaters before the Justice League is like if Kiss had gotten into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ahead of the Beatles. But perhaps the most difficult task at hand for Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan's mega-hyped reworking of the seminal superhero will finally be getting the live-action movie arm of the Superman franchise out from under the shadow of the original Richard Donner film. A classic so revered it remains for many the yardstick by which the entire genre is still judged, and the standard Superman in particular can't just seem to escape. It was the first time a superhero story had been treated the lavish, big-star Hollywood spectacle, even if there wouldn't be another similar success until 1989's Batman, and the genre wouldn't fully come to dominate theaters until 1-2-3 punch of Blade, X-Men, and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man at the turn of the millennium. I don't know that there's been a movie adaptation of anything that was already popular that loomed so large and had such a lasting effect over its original material. Christopher Reeve is the Superman by which all others will forever be judged. Most music associated with the character can't help but try and sound like John Williams' score, and the new to that film takes on the mythos like Superman's shield being a Krypton family crest, the new agey crystal Krypton, Jor-El's holographic image hanging around the Fortress of Solitude, and Clark Kent starting his career as an adult, rather than being Superboy first, have wormed their way into countless subsequent versions of the character, for better or for worse. This is why I partially don't mind that Man of Steel is choosing to tell the second or third most widely known origin story on the planet again, since it's probably necessary to start completely from scratch and make sure every piece of the new Superman is a notably distinct thing from its famous doppelganger in the original. I mean, I'll still mind if they somehow managed to f*** it up. The Nolan brothers and David Goyer were in charge of the story after all, and with those guys in comic book movies you either get yeah or that's too bad. But I understand the necessity of trying to change it up all the same. But despite, or indeed because, of how culturally omnipresent it is, the actual merits of the Donner-Reeves Superman are often given a secondary consideration to the magnitude of its place in the cultural pantheon. I mean, that it's a classic is undisputed, but does it hold up? Is it still that good? Was it ever that good? Well, hell yeah, I think so. This is a movie I revisit pretty frequently, and while it's definitely not perfect either as an adaptation of Superman or just as a movie in and of itself, despite all that and its problematic ubiquity, this remains just a flat-out really good movie. And it's easy to see why the franchise has been falling short of it ever since. It doesn't really require much more endorsement beyond being a really well-made, well-acted, well-directed fantasy adventure, but it's particularly spectacular in the context of its time. No one had ever even attempted to do this before. Sure, there had been fanciful movies and big effects-driven spectacles and even movies based on comics before, but no one had ever tried to take the unique visual and storytelling tropes of the superhero to the big screen in a respectable full-scale production. Where were they even supposed to start? Should it be a comedy, a children's film, some kind of sci-fi affected drama? Keep in mind, even though everyone knew Superman and DC Comics was having a very profitable tail end of the Silver Age, most of the people making decisions on this film would have been more familiar with the Golden Age Superman, whose adventures often had more in common with lighthearted children's stories or cartoon slapstick than the action-heavy feel modern comic fans were more familiar with. Hell, when Richard Donner signed on to the project, he found that the screenplay they were using, and they were shooting Superman and Superman 2 together at the same time too, had become a campy, jokey mess that he opted to throw out and start over from scratch. They gave Marlon Brando what was at the time one of the biggest paydays in Hollywood history for a cameo as Jor-El, and then had to deal with his strange initial insistence that he be allowed to play the part either as a talking bagel or an animated suitcase. No, really, that he wanted to do that. You can look that up. And yet, somehow, it all comes together. I think a big part of the formula is that Donner managed to find, as the first guy to attempt this, I remind you, a kind of perfect balance between movie realism and comic book fantasy, finding parallels between must-film iconic Superman moments and established familiar cinematic styles. The Krypton stuff is trippy 70s sci-fi, the Smallville scenes are straight out of John Ford meets Norman Rockwell American pastoral playbook, the big action set pieces play out like the disaster movies so popular at the time, the romance with Lois Lane and the Daily Planet scenes are rapid-fire banter a la the neo-screwball adult comedies of Woody Allen and Robert Altman, and Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor seems like he was expecting to fight James Bond instead. The movie isn't out to prove that Superman is realistic, it's out to prove that he belongs in the movies. Oh, and speaking of Gene Hackman, I know a lot of people like to hate on this version of Lex Luthor, and apart from the dopey Can You Read My Mind stuff with Lois, it's probably the weaker part of the movie, but Hackman is a lot of fun in the part, and honestly the ridiculous nuke half of California so my worthless real estate becomes valuable waterfront property villain plan is a thoroughly modern version of the crazy master scheme stuff associated with Lex Luthor in the Gold and Silver Ages before DC retconned him into just another nyahaha, I'm rich and I'm evil businessman guy from the 80s. But what really puts it over the edge is how profoundly it manages to get a character as difficult as Superman. In a way, flawed, broken anti-heroes like Batman, Dirty Harry, Wolverine, whoever, are easier to get right because they give you more layers to work with. But Superman is supposed to be a genuine icon of our potential for ultimate good realized, and that kind of character, one who's already attained complete uncomplicated goodness to the extent that the development is all about the other characters reacting to him being the real thing, is really hard to do. This movie pulls it off, Captain America did it, I guess Jesus movies do it too, but that's a whole other thing. My point is, this movie got Superman in a way that almost no one has managed to since, and while I'm looking forward to Man of Steel, whether or not it will be yet another admirable try that misses the point and the mark remains to be seen. We'll find out soon enough, but if it doesn't, well, there's always still this one. And I guess Avengers 2 in a couple years. Folks, these are the tough ones. Raves are easy. The hard part is coming down off Cloud 9 to look for flaws you can find. Eviscerating outright disasters? Hell, that can be fun. But notably imperfect? That's not easy. You know there's stuff in there you like, stuff that really works, and you'd like to be able to just appreciate for itself, but you know it's still broken or malformed in some nagging specific way that just won't let you overlook it. Because make no mistake, there are moments where Man of Steel looks and feels damn near perfect. The action scenes, particularly a spectacular series of brawls between good and evil superhumans, will unquestionably be the new gold standard for such sequences, at least in strictly visual terms. In fact, as a pure visual experience, it comes maddeningly close to being kind of a masterpiece. Zack Snyder finds a unique-looking, lived-in, washed-out aesthetic that accomplishes the difficult task of making the film that takes place alternately on an alien planet, rural Kansas, and an urban city appear perfectly cohesive. The production design is uniformly gorgeous, even when it's not terribly original. Whatever they spent on this, it looks like they spent a lot more. Unfortunately, all of those visuals are built around a screenplay from David Goyer from a story by Christopher Nolan, and while those two heavy hitters had pretty damn impressive 2 out of 3 track record on Batman movies, it feels more than a little bit like one or both of them have utterly failed to wrap their heads around Superman. While the story doesn't pull any huge shakeups with the well-known origin story, which for the record occurs mainly in flashbacks, it does end up trying to expand on some of the more arch or just because aspects, with heaping helpings of exhaustively explained mechanisms, plot devices, and other sundry gobbledygook because, well, look who we're working with here, almost all of which ends up adding nothing more than tedious extra weight. To wit, for reasons that are over-explained yet still don't make any sense, planet Krypton's destruction is now partially owed to its inhabitants having embraced a predetermination eugenics policy. Kal-El, the first natural birth to occur on the planet in centuries, is therefore special and blasted off to Earth by his parents just as the military class led by General Zod attempts a failed but still destructive coup. Fast forward 30 or so years later, and Kal-El is living on Earth as Clark Kent, acting as an undercover superhero while ferreting out details about his origins. But when Zod and his crew of Kryptonian survivors turn up looking for a similarly over-explained yet still nonsensical and ultimately kind of meaningless MacGuffin, supposedly in his possession, Clark must embrace the role of Superman in order to fend off the invasion and choose his true fate. I'm not a huge fan of adaptations like this needing to tie every damn thing together, i.e. Superman's origins, Zod's scheme, and everything else about them having to be intimately connected as opposed to say, hey, it's a big universe, these things happen. Not out of some fealty to the material, but because it takes away from the bigger heroic ideal of the character. Lip service is paid to the idea of Superman as an example to mankind and to the importance of him not having a pre-programmed societal role like Zod, and in theory I even like the idea that if Superman did show up in 21st century America, we'd be more frightened of him than welcoming, but as a total package, it all feels like they've purposefully crafted a Superman movie for people who never liked Superman, or at least who never quite engaged with the more universal fantasy fulfillment aspects of the character, i.e. freedom from gravity and pain, but might be interested in what various things end up looking like after he's punched and or kicked them. And you know what? Maybe that's enough this time, for enough people. A certain lack of visceral action was a substantial issue with the last attempt at a big Superman movie after all, and it certainly seems to be enough for Warner Brothers
they're already talking sequel. One of the big overarching mission statements of this project was to make Superman cool again, and to the degree that cool means an enthusiastic thumbs up from moody, aggressive, attention-challenged 14-year-olds, well, mission almost certainly accomplished. Unsurprisingly, considering their prior DC Comics pedigrees, the story from Nolan and Goyer is heavily invested in stripping Superman the icon of all the sincerity and earnestness that many have always mistaken for camp, replacing it with the stoic brooding of an angry teenager with something to prove. And I can easily remember a time in my own life when this kind of Superman would have seemed awesome to me. Unfortunately, it was the same time in which I thought Spawn was awesome, or hell, 90s Superman for that matter. What can I say? I guess I outgrew maturity. To be honest, the end result of all this feels a lot less like a Superman movie than it does Dragon Ball Z, the Americanized Dragon Ball Z, where they stripped out most of the humor and cultural idiosyncrasy to focus on unironic adolescent rage. The film's canvas is magnificent, its scope is beautiful, its action is thrilling, but its heart is joyless, sullen, and grim, and I'm sorry, as exciting as it all is, that just doesn't feel very super a lot of the time. It'd be one thing if this was a dark knighting of the character right up front, but Jor-El just keeps droning on about how inspiring and hopeful Superman is supposed to be, while inspiration and hope are as absent from the actual film as awe and optimism. Henry Cavill makes a fine Superman with enough raw charisma and charm to overcome the script's coldness and distance regarding his character. Russell Crowe is fun as a drastically reimagined Jor-El, and it's fun to watch pros like Harry Lennox, Christopher Maloney, and Richard Schiff turn stock military characters into scene stealers. Kevin Costner and Diane Lane are both very good as Ma and Pa Kent, though not quite good enough to overcome a script that doesn't want them to be much more than marble statues of perfect all-American parenthood. Lawrence Fishburne is solid as Perry White, but honestly, he and the Daily Planet guys are glorified cameo. They're only there to check Daily Planet off the must-include list. Sadly, the weak link turns out to be Amy Adams as Lois Lane. Oh, she's fine, but her role is really perfunctory. Her performance is good, and they're obviously trying to make her a more proactive version of the character, but it feels like she's only there because Lois Lane just kinda has to be here, to the point that it wouldn't surprise me at all if early drafts of the script left her out entirely. Much more problematically, she and Cavill have shockingly little chemistry, and the story doesn't do them any favors. Not only did I never believe these people were falling for each other, I didn't believe that the sequence of events would lead them to. I don't know what went wrong, but yeah, I'm as surprised as you are. But really, it's Michael Shannon as General Zod who ends up owning the movie. This guy has been one of our best character actors forever, and it's so awesome to see him cut loose in a big, showy, scenery-chewing, and yet surprisingly nuanced villain who exudes real depth despite how ultimately pointless all the genetic destiny business turns out to be. Sure, it's painfully clear that Zod was picked for the main heavy because he's the familiar Superman villain most capable of generating the fist fight to end all fistfights, and even though it directly follows a pair of exhausting and however lovely, very repetitive city destruction sequences in a row, he really owns the moment, and said moment really is the stuff comic book dreams are made of. Yes, I repeat, this is not a bad movie at all. It's spectacularly broken to the point that I'd hope the inevitable sequel opts for a G.I. Joe 2 style top-down rebuild, but it stays standing and the parts that work like gangbusters. Judged strictly as a sensory overload roller coaster of gorgeously photographed comic book panels in motion, it defines the word must-see, but is unfortunately undercut every time you must listen to its dreary, tedious story. A story that is very, very concerned with the clash of values between the quiet humility Clark has inherited from his human father versus the messianic grandiosity bequeathed by his Kryptonian father, but where I just kept wishing one of his two moms would have sat him down and said, you know, it's okay to experience some levity once in a while. You're f***ing Superman. See you next time. So, Man of Steel banked enough money over the weekend to feed and or purchase several impoverished small countries, surprising absolutely no one given that superhero movies are the most popular genre on the planet right now and Superman is the most well-known character in that particular genre and has been for about 75 years and counting. Either way, with the film now branded a bona fide hit with or without its less than stellar reviews, the question now immediately becomes what next? After all, the entire production history of this movie is also quite openly the production history of how Warner Brothers planned to build its own answer to Marvel's ultra-successful Avengers project. Hell, when I went to see it, damn near the entire audience sat through the credits only to groan loudly when it turned out there wasn't any teaser on the end like they've gotten used to seeing in these things. But of course, there never was going to be one. The main thing that Warner Brothers has always been surprisingly open about regarding their plans for the DC Universe movies is that they don't have any plans for the DC Universe movies. They had a plan, supposedly, that was going to follow off of Green Lantern, but then Green Lantern turned out to be so they had to start all over again. They've pretty much just been waiting to see what kind of numbers Man of Steel would do, and now that we know those numbers are big, you can assume the serious planning phase stuff started sometime yesterday morning. So yeah, any kind of speculation at this point would be just that, speculation. This isn't like Thor or Captain America where you could freeze frame through the movie and find all kinds of clues about who or what was going to happen in later people's movies. Outside of the LexCorp building and the Wayne logo on that satellite, the only world Man of Steel appears interested in building was its own. Which, by the way, I have exactly zero issue with. There's no law that said every damn superhero movie needs to follow Marvel's template just because it's been successful. If Warner Brothers wants to borrow from the Avengers playbook, they should borrow the self-assured confidence in the material, not the business strategy. What has my curiosity piqued is that I'm not entirely sure there's a lot of places for Man of Steel to actually go as a franchise, even strictly on its own terms. And I'm not just saying that because I thought the film was good, but not really that good. What I mean is, the more I think about the movie, the more it feels like it would be somewhat difficult to find a compelling place for it to go after this. I know I put the warning up at the beginning, but just in case, this would be where the big, huge, major spoilers go, folks, so last chance to back out. Okay, let's get right to the nitty-gritty. At the climax of Man of Steel, General Zod forces Superman into a confrontation wherein the only way Superman can prevent him from straight-up murdering a random family of 4 is to use lethal force himself, which he does. That's our big ending. Superman kills General Zod with his bare hands. Now, this scene bugs the hell out of me on a lot of levels. Yeah, I'm gonna be that guy. Superman shouldn't kill people. He just shouldn't. And I'm not buying the only possible option handwave in this particular scenario. He's Superman. He can do anything. That's one of the main points. No, scratch that. That's really kind of the only point to this character. Yes, realistically, I understand that the real reason most superheroes were written with a do-not-kill policy is so that popular bad guys can keep coming back month after month, and those same concerns aren't necessarily valid for the more limited run of a live-action movie franchise, but in every medium, it's always made sense for Superman. And yeah, I know in the movie he freaked out about killing Zod, but when you think about it, even that was kind of a weird moment because they'd never bothered to establish earlier that this version of Superman doesn't kill his enemies. Like, I get the idea of the scene in the context of this movie is that killing someone with his super strength is the literal manifestation of everything he'd always been afraid of about himself, and obviously I can appreciate the symbolic value in Superman breaking one of the cardinal don't rules, but it's kind of odd that they never specify that this is part of his code anywhere beforehand, especially since it doesn't look like he's been holding back all that much elsewhere in the movie. Here's the thing, if we've now already established that this Superman is willing to kill his enemies to save the lives of others, well, alright, but doesn't that kind of suck the suspense out of every potential Superman-level threat that could turn up in the future now that this particular horse has left the barn? I mean, most of the stuff Lex Luthor tends to cook up is going to result in the deaths of a lot more than 4 people. Ditto guys like Brainiac or Parasite. Hell, Darkseid, anybody? So what exactly is going to be the excuse for why he doesn't just show up in Act 2 of every sequel and go, yeah, this evil plot of yours is gonna kill people, so you're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead. I mean, other than Kryptonite. But even beyond that one issue that, let's be honest, they can probably write their way out of easily enough, I'm not really able to summon all that much interest in spending any more time in the Man of Steel universe in general, even though I overall didn't hate the movie. Oh, I'm sure I'll come around on it if and when we start hearing about the potentially interesting things in the work, and yes, in case you're wondering, I recognize that I'm being very much part of the problem with modern blockbusters by talking about sequel fatigue not even a week after the movie opened, but right now that's where I'm at. I didn't dislike this movie, but I also didn't really get swept up in it beyond a purely superficial sensory level, and a big part of the reason why is that it's so relentlessly dour and downbeat and funereal in tone. I'm just not in love with mopey, dreary Superman, so I'm not exactly champing at the bit to meet the mopey, dreary version of Supergirl, mopey, dreary Batman, mopey, dreary Wonder Woman, mopey, dreary, Martian Manhunter, or whoever else might be turning up to help Kal-El sulk through the sequels. But then again, Man of Steel's final moments do provide the first appearance of the nerdy reporter version of Clark Kent, which could very easily be taken as an indicator that this is all very deliberate and they're looking to have him lighten up as the series goes on. So, okay, color me sort of hopeful. Still not officially excited, but hopeful. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. Hey, wow! Warner Brothers actually found a guy to play Bruce Wayne in Man of Steel 2, Batman vs. Superman, or whatever the hell they're gonna call it. What's more, they found a big deal actor, which is kinda surprising since this would mean signing on to the sequel to a movie that was poorly reviewed and despite a good haul was not the financial success that the studio was banking on, and fairly or not, you're gonna face the inevitable prospect of being negatively compared to Christian Bale.
You never give it to an ordinary citizen! Where's the trigger? Where is it? Where is it?
Or maybe that won't actually be that tough of a hurdle to clear. But yeah, they found a major star to be the new Batman, and he's a hell of a get. An actor with a distinguished track record who's proven himself in drama, comedy, and action, and who's a celebrated writer, director, producer, and 2-time Academy Award winner. And he's a big fan of comic books and the superhero genre. I mean, geez, if anything was going to make me even cautiously optimistic for this movie after the slog that was Man of Steel, and the ongoing slow-motion train wreck that seems to be Warner Brothers' bumbling approach to creating the DC movie universe, that kind of pedigree would do it. And said pedigree belongs to... Boston's own Ben Affleck. Awesome. Awesome pick. So awesome, I'm actually kind of surprised the studio and creative team behind these debacles made it. So what did the citizens of Nerd Nation think when this news broke over the weekend? What the hell, guys? Seriously, what is everyone's big problem with this? I'm not even being facetious. I literally do not understand why this would be bad news to anybody. I mean, he's a white guy with a strong chin, so he passes the only physical requirement to play Batman there really is. And he's a good actor. Yes, he's a good actor. Oh, did he do some goofy movies before? Yeah, sure. What, the last guy who played Batman didn't?
With all the muckety mucks, I'm blowing my dough and going deluxe.
The main things everyone keeps bringing up are Geely and Daredevil. Those movies came out 10 years ago. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? I'm not, and this guy clearly isn't. We're talking about a guy who underwent a complete career reinvention and revival here. Huh, funny actor on a career comeback playing the hyper-competent mortal in a team of superheroes? Where'd they get that crazy idea? In fact, this isn't a total out-of-left-field surprise. Back before Warner Brothers even settled on making Man of Steel the main start of the new run of DC movies, they were looking at just doing Justice League right off the bat. And the big rumor at the time was they offered the director's chair to Ben Affleck. This would have been right around the time when The Town had just been a massive hit for the same studio. Supposedly, that job would have come with a catch. They wanted him to be Batman. Now, obviously, he passed on it then, but one of those things has clearly changed. I wonder if the other part has too. He apparently signed on for more than one movie. Will Ben Affleck also direct Justice League? Could he possibly write it? Oh, hey, will they let him take a pass at writing the Versus Superman script since a crappy screenplay was the main thing that dragged down Man of Steel? We can only hope. You kinda have to feel bad for Henry Cavill though, right? Hey man, thanks for risking your nascent Hollywood career on this role that has destroyed the career prospects of pretty much every actor who's ever played it. But we're not confident that anyone actually wants to see you play Superman again, so not only are we calling Batman in for insurance, we're getting someone way more established and famous than you to play him. Tough break. But you know what I really like about this choice? Here are some words that are not typically used to describe Ben Affleck. Dark, brooding, angsty, intense. In fact, his whole thing is generally being likable and even funny, even when he plays a hard-bitten criminal. It's what he does. So maybe this is an indication that it's finally gotten through to the filmmakers that they've gone as far as they can possibly go with psycho thug Batman, and perhaps we'll get something a little more, dare I hope, fun, like the grim but still functionally human Batman from the animated series, or the I'm actually having fun with this life version of him from Brave and the Bold. Honestly, the only reason for me not to think of this as a total positive is that however good a choice Ben Affleck is, the same creative team that made seemingly every wrong decision they could find to make on Man of Steel is still overwhelmingly in charge. And they're still, by all indications, going with Batman vs. Superman as a starting premise. When they announced the film at Comic-Con, they did so with a quote from Frank Miller's landmark, groundbreaking, but also, let's face it, incredibly dated and more than a little overpraised Dark Knight Returns, which is typically seen as having originated the modern idea that these two characters should be ideological opposites or outright enemies rather than allies. I hate to be a wet blanket here, but all of those things are red flags as far as I'm concerned. I mean, Batman vs. Superman, aka Who Would Win, is not the premise of a movie. It's the premise of a scene in a movie. Unless we're talking about stuff like Freddy vs. Jason or King Kong vs. Godzilla, where the guys fighting are these force of nature things that drive the plot but actually aren't the main characters. Keep in mind, we've already more or less seen these same two guys go at it in the form of Iron Man vs. Thor in The Avengers, and it was awesome. And part of the reason why it was awesome is that it was over in like 2 minutes, which is about as long as these things need to last. They went at it, both guys used all their best powers, we saw who could do what to who, and then it was done and we got on with the story. And no, Batman pulling out a succession of gadgets to checkmate Superman isn't a story. In fact, while I'm here, isn't the whole Batman always wins so long as he has time to prepare cliche from the comics and elsewhere kind of a double plus dumb at this point? I mean, I know why it exists. It's the same reason why Spider-Man always wins in the Marvel Universe, because they're the most popular characters. But whereas Spidey tends to win just because, Batman, it's usually all about this fetishism for his preparedness, which when you get right down to it is really just fetishism for his money. The backstory of almost all Batman's celebrated resourcefulness is that he's always had more than enough wealth, by inheritance incidentally, to buy all the best gear and spend his life learning all these skills in lieu of ever having to work for a living. So Batman vs. Superman always gets framed as the triumph of an ordinary mortal besting a god, but it's really not. Bruce Wayne is not John Henry beating the steam-powered hammer. He's Mitt Romney with a doomsday bunker and a leather fetish. And speaking of fetishes, modern comics fixation on this particular version of this particular character, embodying entitlement and vengeance by proxy, finding a way to purchase victory over a character that's supposed to embody hope and optimism, is emblematic of just about everything that went wrong with modern comics. And not uncoincidentally, that's also most of what went wrong in Green Lantern, Dark Knight Rises, and Man of Steel. So yeah, Ben Affleck is Batman, I am psyched. Ben Affleck is Batman in this particular franchise, still not getting optimistic about that one. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. Okay, let's get this really straight. I am declaring Man of Steel to be the most disappointing movie of this past summer. Not the worst movie of the summer, not the worst Superman movie, not the worst recent DC Comics movie, not the least good Christopher Nolan movie, or Zack Snyder movie, or even David Goyer movie. It's not even a bad movie, it's just not an especially good movie. And given the talent of the people involved, the caliber of the material it has to draw from, and the majesty of those first few trailers, yeah, this was an extremely rare case of me letting myself get unrealistically hopeful and winding up with a big old pile of eh. And yeah, if you go back and watch the original review, it sounds a bit more positive than this. The fact is, I was only a little disappointed the first time I saw it, which was just a couple of days before the review ran. Generally, my overall assessment of a film doesn't change all that much. I work hard to keep my analytical instrument functioning well enough that I can properly cycle through the considerations and second guesses fast enough that I don't need to sit around and ruminate for a week to decide what I thought of a given movie. I mean, if I couldn't do that, I wouldn't be very much good at this job. But the spoilery big picture episode that I ran just a few days later clearly indicated that for whatever reason I had been far too generous in my original appraisal of Man of Steel. The more I thought about the movie, the less I liked it. That's never a good sign, but it turned out to be a steady phenomenon. The more thought I give this movie, the less I like it. And I'm not talking about little incidental details at this point. Superman killing Zod doesn't really work for me, but a better movie could have recovered from that. I'm sick to death of the desaturated, gloomy, joyless Christopher Nolan superhero aesthetic, but the movie had been as good as Dark Knight, it wouldn't have mattered as much. Superman doesn't really seem to care about saving people and collateral damage. Yeah, that's a legit problem, but it ties in with the bigger issue. Point is, there's a world of difference between not being the Superman movie I'd ideally like to see and being a bad Superman movie. It's also not really a grand secret why Man of Steel doesn't work overall. It has a horrible, horrible screenplay. The structure's bad, none of the characters act or talk like actual human beings or larger-than-life icons of pop mythology, and it relies on a needless and convoluted MacGuffin to drive its central conflict. The question becomes, or rather the question is, why does it have all these problems? Now that's kind of impossible to answer definitively if you weren't there while it was being written. I mean, it's possible something heavy fell on David Goyer's head in the middle of the first draft and that explains everything, but Occam's razor suggests a slightly more simple possibility from where I sit. You know, there was a funny bit in an episode of King of the Hill once where Peggy summarized the behavior of newly arrived Arlen hipsters thusly: they don't know what they want, they only know what they don't want. And I think Man of Steel at a conceptual level is similarly afflicted. It doesn't really have a strong sense of what it's trying to accomplish, at least nowhere near as strong as its sense of what it doesn't want to be. It doesn't want to be the Richard Donner Superman. It doesn't want to be Superman Returns. It doesn't want to be the Superman of the DC animated universe or even the Superman of the original comics, which in and of itself is kind of troubling since it indicates that the filmmakers are starting from the premise that the material they're adapting is somehow broken or inadequate and in need of their repair. But that wouldn't necessarily be a deal breaker if they did have some kind of revolutionary new take on the material. But outside of a vague attempt to make Superman's alienness and non-humanity the more central aspect of his characterization because, hey, who wants a superhero who isn't constantly morose and tormented all the time? Man of Steel doesn't really have one. It just has a lengthy list of don'ts. In the most glaring example, a constant criticism of the film has been that it's bloated with too many endless, overly violent action scenes and seems to ignore the more classical version of Superman as a character who exists to protect and rescue people in favor of an exclusive focus on his ability to punch things really hard. A creative decision that can't help but feel like an attempt to answer the criticism of Superman Returns supposedly not having enough action scenes. And this gets to the heart of the matter. To be fair, making a shallow, gritty, empty-headed, action-centric 90s-style Superman movie was probably never going to be a good idea, but if that had been the movie they'd been selling, it probably wouldn't have been such a huge letdown. Like I said, Star Trek Into Darkness was a much worse movie than Man of Steel, but it didn't look very good to begin with, and the first one was only just okay. Man of Steel was promising something else entirely, something bigger, something better. I'm not just talking about those early trailers and the story and the themes and the tone they were selling, since the movie was selling them too. The characters, Clark Kent's two father figures especially, go on and on about the idea of Superman as a symbol of hope and achievement. The staging of scenes, composition of shots, and use of music, Zack Snyder remains as ever a master of cinematic aestheticism, if not necessarily directing actors or composing a coherent story, all lean on mythic iconography sculpted specifically to reinforce the sensation that what's happening is important and means something. But it doesn't. It's like piping classical music into a Burger King and hoping it'll make the Whoppers start tasting like a $50 steak. Eventually, the dissonance starts to make the film's fundamental emptiness feel even more empty. All the Terrence Malick-style pastoral iconography in the world can't make Jonathan Kent's nonsensical, suicidally paranoid philosophizing feel like anything other than a clumsy way of dragging out the origin story. No matter how much cheap visual reference to 9/11 you pile into the battle in Metropolis, you can't make the fates of its empty, one-note characters mean anything outside of a body count. And no matter how gravely and solemnly these people intone David Goyer's tin-eared, terrible dialogue, it's never going to sound profound or affecting. In the end, Man of Steel was a movie with big aspirations, big shoes to fill, and a big game to talk, and it was a big miss on all counts. And that's why what, under other circumstances, might have been just another swing and a miss for the surprisingly difficult to get a handle on Superman franchise, turns out to be the biggest, most crushing disappointment of summer 2013. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.
So Man of Steel opens in 2013. It does good, but not as good as Warner Brothers wants it to. The billion-dollar returns on Iron Man 3 and the huge reception for Phase 2 of the Marvel movies in general, even with Thor 2 being generally agreed to be not very good and Age of Ultron coming up short versus the original Avengers, has effectively convinced every studio that the superhero boom is here to stay, and Warner Brothers specifically to pivot as hard as possible into Zack Snyder's DCEU plans that results in what we will now watch play out over the rest of this fucking retrospective. For now, it begins here, and so does what will become a lot of examples of me saying things that you will hear me repeat again and 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 again. So remember, this is a decade of work we're looking back at, and I like to think of it less as I told you so and more called it. Context up front, the shift here from Big Picture to In Bob We Trust coincides with my first run at the original incarnation of the Escapist website as a film critic and producer of the Big Picture series coming to an end, and starting as a semi-independent run where for several years the rights to the Big Picture and the attendant imagery, visuals, titles, etc. still being properties of that website, so we had to generate new IP called In Bob We Trust, where I got an offer to do a new version of the same type of show for a website called Screw Attack, along with a revival series that I'd done for them back when I was starting out called Game Overthinker. And now additionally, while I was doing movie reviews independently on my own channel, where the aesthetic was more whatever we could put together, now that was very quickly shifted over to doing professional reviews again for a site called Geek.com, which ran for about 3 years and unfortunately were made under contract. Even though that site isn't a thing anymore, I'm not 100% legally clear on whoever would own the rights to what's left of it. They might still own the finished video, so I believe I can only play portions of the audio for them, but I wanted to get those parts in for the sake of completion and context, so you're going to see those in there as still audio files. So presenting that.
The only thing, let's say, able to fully die in an entire genre of movies are the think pieces and hot takes about whether or not a genre of movies has died. And yet every couple of years we have to do this dance anyway about horror, romance, westerns, whatever. Currently on the block is the superhero movie, largely because the current incarnation of the genre is popular enough that plenty of people in Hollywood are getting sick of being asked about making them, and because clickbaiters can only run so many happy headlines about a thing before the fly strip gets full and they have to change flavors to negative to keep the traffic going. I really have no interest in engaging the question, mainly because nobody actually wants it answered. The question, will superhero movies die, is actually film journalist code talk, for I am not particularly interested in covering this genre anymore, so when can I expect it to no longer be the dominant topic of conversation? Not that I don't sympathize, I also write about video games, and it'd be nice to know when we're no longer talking so much about what's to be done with overpopulation among Eumetopias jubatus and Alligatoridae mississippiensis. The latest round of this was touched off by Steven Spielberg, stating that he believes the genre will sooner than later go the way of the Western, which led director Zack Snyder to opine that Spielberg was probably right, except for the trio of superheroes he's currently directing 3 movies about. Now, far be it from me to try and out-film history Steven Spielberg, but I would point out that it's an unfair comparison because the huge generational changes in the public perception of an actual period in history that ultimately led to the decline of the Western genre probably doesn't apply to fictional comic book universes. For example, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has made audiences all over the world fall in love with a guy named Captain America, even though those feelings are not always mirrored in regards to the actual America these days. That's kind of impressive when you think about it. Anyway, I mean, hell, remember this genre died before and didn't really die? Remember that? When Batman and Robin came out and killed the entire genre? Yeah, that time around, Death lasted a whole 13 months, and then Blade came out and was a huge big hit, and then X-Men came out and was a huge big hit, and then Spider-Man came out and was a massive worldwide phenomenon, and now here we are. So that's that. No, the genre isn't dying, that's not even an interesting question, move along, done, mic drop. But you know what is interesting, is the question of whether or not the genre is even going to slow down anytime soon, or if that's something that just isn't going to happen anymore in the age of multimedia franchising. See, while westerns didn't die, they did decline from being a massive part of the film industry's output to something we only get a couple of every few years, and I wonder if that level of change in terms of cultural presence is even possible anymore, for superheroes or for anything else. The fact is, the digital age has hyper-accelerated the life cycle of things coming into and out of popularity almost to the point where a movie franchise can go from biggest thing ever to over to retro cool again in between its own sequels. Look, I'm 34. I got to live half my life to this point in the age before the internet, and I sometimes feel like my generation is the last one that's going to experience nostalgia in its true uncut memories of beloved things lost to time form. I once asked a group of mostly 18 to 20-year-olds if they already felt nostalgia for stuff they grew up with like Power Rangers or Pokemon, and the response was largely, What do you mean, nostalgia? Those things never went away. Even their TV shows are still on, with new episodes in the same ongoing continuity. I mean, shit, forget the superheroes for a minute. Look at Star Wars. Star Wars isn't even a genre, it's a single franchise that might as well be one. There hasn't been a good movie in this series since 1983, but it never really went away in terms of toys and comics and all the other cross-media business, and now we're about to have not only a new Star Wars trilogy, but also a world where at least one new Star Wars-related movie is in theaters every year, along with new comics, TV shows, books, and games unified to a degree that'll make the Marvel continuity feel like kindergartners playing telephone. And even without all that, will we ever really be able to say that Star Wars is done for even a little while when Disney is keeping an entire Star Wars World theme park running 365 days a year in Orlando? It's honestly starting to feel to me like the real model for popular media going forward in the age of franchises and multimedia is The Simpsons. No, really. Remember, when The Simpsons first appeared, it immediately became one of the biggest entertainment institutions on the planet, generating a glut of mostly Bart-themed merchandise based around merchandising to kids while remaining an untouchable high-watermark TV for about a decade, but then gradually became merely incredibly popular instead of omnipresent and not necessarily appointment viewing, even as the merchandising ramped up to higher levels than before, largely by shifting to the adult collector market. Now, especially in the wake of how big a deal that marathon turned out to be last year, hindsight reveals The Simpsons, which has been declared dead multiple times, as a phenomenon that's gone through peaks and valleys in perception, but has never gone away culturally. And even once it ends, and it will eventually end, the ubiquity of this property in the collective conscious, and that one cable channel that pretty much exists only to show Simpsons reruns, means that it's probably never going away. It's just going to hover forever as a permanent element of the pop culture oxygen supply in between the inevitable movie sequels, reunion specials, and reboots. And I really feel like that's where Marvel, DC, Star Wars, and who knows what next are all going. Anything remotely popular is just gonna hang around now. The internet has basically destroyed the concept of entropy in art and entertainment. Nothing goes away, nothing gets forgotten. In 2025, is a new guy playing Tony Stark, or did the Iron Man armor just keep changing hands through consistent continuity? That's where we're going. Is that bad? I don't know. No one does. It's an entirely new cultural paradigm with no real historical precedent, so it should be exciting if nothing else. But for now, sorry, our superhero movies dying film press people. In a couple of years, your outlet will still be frantic for coverage of a Squirrel Girl casting announcement, and the guy or gal on staff who doesn't have to make any calls to the research department because they grew up with a copy of the official handbook under their pillow, they're probably gonna get it over you. So my advice, pull up Wikipedia and start making some notes. So, let's talk all about that exciting new trailer for the upcoming superhero sequel where the good guys take time off from fighting the bad guys to fight each other for some reason. No, the other upcoming superhero sequel where the good guys take time off from fighting the bad guys to fight each other for some reason.
Son of Krypton versus Bat of Gotham.
There we go, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the movie that deigns to answer the question, can Warner Brothers simultaneously launch a DC cinematic universe branching out from Man of Steel, while also making people forgive or forget Man of Steel being a really bad movie? WB has a lot invested in this project succeeding, since they're already in production on a long line of spin-offs and sequels for a Justice League franchise and solo films for its various members, even though it's not entirely clear whether or not audiences actually want a whole run of movies built around grim, gritty reimaginings of what used to be the sunnier brand of superheroics. Apparently, they're so anxious to make sure everyone wants to see this, they've taken the bold step of cutting a trailer that seems to give away the entire plot of the film, including a few bits that feel like they might at some point have been meant as a surprise. Don't believe me? Go watch the trailer and tell me if you don't feel like you've already watched the whole movie. Superman and Batman have an issue with each other, Lex Luthor nudges Batman into trying to fight the Man of Steel, it doesn't totally work out, so Luthor makes something even worse, and they have to team up and fight it, and oh hey, here's Wonder Woman, presumably having not revealed herself as a superhero before this point. I'm getting the sense that's pretty much the movie. I mean, the whole point to this film is that these guys are fighting, and the trailer gives away when they'll choose to stop fighting, why they do, what they're teaming up against, and what looks and feels a lot like the reveal of the third big character. That's kinda nutty. I mean, what else could this movie possibly do to surprise anybody? Oh. Anyway, my big takeaway is that, yeah, this actually looks like a lot of fun and more pure, uncompromised Zack Snyder movie than the self-serious slog than Man of Steel was, but it also looks surprisingly simplistic plot-wise. I mean, let's not mince words here. These things are, fairly or not, playing catch-up to the Marvel movies, and it'll be kinda strange if this really does just end up rehashing heroes fight, oh no, a monster, we're friends now. Sure, that was more than adequate for the Avengers, but that's because no one had ever tried to do a movie like that before. Is this too little, too late as a narrative? Maybe. Also, while I really dig the high contrasty Jim Lee-esque look of the whole thing, and I think this is probably the best live-action Batman costume ever, even if I'm not a small ears fan, I'm not sure that trying to imitate the Frank Miller Dark Knight brick shithouse look is working for them. I don't know, I get the logic, but Batman is supposed to be basically a ninja, so it's weird that he's way more jacked than Superman is. Just saying. And then there's the new Lex Luthor. Alright, look, I get that it's a reimagining, and to be honest, I've never really liked any version of the post-crisis corporate bad guy Lex, so whatever. And I know the whole point is supposed to be the brain guy versus the brawn guy, but it looks ridiculous to have a Lex Luthor who'd get his ass kicked by a normal Clark Kent. More substantively, this whole thing where every corporate bad guy in movies has to be a takeoff on Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg to make some kind of topical point about Silicon Valley and the tech sector is seriously played out, and someone needs to find a new angle. I mean, not that they could have known this at the time, but with a real-life supervillain running for president of the United States right now, this is going to be a really dated bad guy reference by the time it comes out. And then there's Doomsday. Finally, both of DC's lame, boring 90s death event villains have made it to the big screen. Yay? To be honest, I could care less that he has a radically new origin for this movie, because Doomsday's comic origin was stupid because Doomsday is a terrible character and the only remotely interesting things about the death of Superman came after his part. I get that Death and Nightfall were books that either got a lot of people started reading or backed into reading comics, so memories of them can be understandably skewed, but no, sorry, no. So, will this movie be any good? I feel like it will, even if it won't be what a lot of people want it to be. It looks like 90s Comics the movie, and as bad as 90s comics largely were, there was a certain undeniable, dumb, trashy, roid-ragey, pissed-off and/or horny teenage idiot energy or charm to the era that's never been precisely captured in a movie before. And while I totally sympathize with DC fans who prefer to see their favorite heroes get the more reverent, source-respectful treatment the Marvel Universe has been getting, there is some novelty here, and it'd be boring if both superhero universe franchises were using the same template. So will this work? Your guess is as good as mine. We'll find out in 3 months. I'm an unapologetic proponent of the superhero movie. The genre has yielded enough genuinely great works during its relatively brief run at the pinnacle of international popular culture so as to forgive a lot of its missteps, and I firmly believe that it offers tremendous artistic and cultural value to those who would take advantage of it. Superheroes can make us laugh, give us catharsis, embody our fantasies, challenge our perceptions, and give mythic weight to political metaphor. Sadly, they can also be stupid, ugly, wrong-headed, intellectually offensive, and boring, and sometimes they can be all that and more. And that's when you wind up with a movie like Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, a malignant, pus-bleeding cancer on the ass of its own genre. I'm sitting here trying to decide where to even start this one, guys. Dawn of Justice is a terrible movie. I literally cannot recall the last time I was so shaken, literally shaking with rage at the climax of something I should hypothetically have loved since the first Transformers movie. It's bad on a level that would seem to defy even the worst vulgarity to met out proper condemnation, the kind of bad movie that begs to be conveyed by the frantic vaudevillian sputter, a futile flailing of the arms, and a stream of old-timey white people profanity. So, I am agog at its awfulness, flabbergasted by the depths of its failing. Billed as a 2.5 solid-hour universe-building DC Comics fanservice exercise, the resulting film plays more like a producer's gambit gone sentient and homicidal. If it were to come out tomorrow that a billionaire philanthropist with a pathological hatred of superhero genre spent $400 million to create a perfect embodiment of every negative prediction the old guard film press ever made about the apocalyptic influence of comic book movies that would suck hard and swallow deep enough to choke to death and take the entire genre down with it, not only would I believe you, it would be more plausible than the actual plot of the film, which attempts to build a foundation for a prospective slate of features to rival the Marvel Cinematic Universe by smushing together the plots of two of the most overrated DC stories of the last 30 years. And when it comes to this rectum-puckering garbage fire of a story, for once, I legitimately believe it when Zack Snyder says the R-rated Blu-ray director's cut absolutely needs to be at least 3 hours long, because at 2.5 hours, the theatrical cut has been so clearly hacked to the fucking bone, the first and second acts occasionally feel like an exercise in seeing how many different locations in a row you can cut to without using an establishing shot. I'd compare its baffling lack of structure and complete disinterest in having a single character behave with adherence to any basic outline of rhyme or reason to the plotting of bad pornography, but even bad pornography tends to at least fade in on whichever San Fernando Valley McMansion the gangbang will eventually take place in. Speaking of pornography, though, to be honest, I can't imagine any psychologically healthy soul being able to pleasure themselves to anything happening on screen in this clusterfuck, unless of course they've got money invested in Civil War. Once the 2 solid hours of relentlessly tedious setup for a plot that somehow manages to be at once overcomplicated yet so simplistic it wouldn't pass storytime muster in a Florida kindergarten has given way to supposed action-packed finale, the whole production devolves into a high-contrast CGI train wreck, so narratively uninvolving and visually unconvincing, it feels less like watching the DC Holy Trinity teaming up to fight Doomsday than it does watching 4 different screensavers awkwardly fuck. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The quote-unquote epic storyline that Zack Snyder, David Goyer, Chris Terrio spent 3 years and a rumored $400 million+ getting made, and that Warner Brothers has potentially mortgaged its next decade as a solvent business on, goes something like this. Lex Luthor dislikes superheroes because reasons, and he hates Superman most of all, so he finds out that Batman is also mad at Superman because people who worked for Batman got killed during the ending of Man of Steel. He undertakes a ridiculously complicated master plan to goad Batman into killing Superman that involves the triggering of a Benghazi-esque foreign policy disaster in North Africa, the staging of a suicide bombing during a United States congressional hearing, and a jar of piss. I'm not even kidding. A major plot point of this movie involves a jar of Lex Luthor's piss. Except Lex didn't really need to go to all that trouble because Batman already wants to kill Superman because he had a psychic nightmare about Darkseid, except Darkseid was played by evil Superman, and also the Flash, I think, popped up out of a time portal and yelled at him about Lois Lane, who then herself gets kidnapped by Lex Luthor along with Superman's mom in order to force Superman to attack Batman, whom Lex has also tricked into building kryptonite weapons in the anti-Superman suit from The Dark Knight Returns, so maybe he can actually kill Superman. But even if he can't kill Superman, it doesn't matter, because Lex has also used alien science magic to turn the body of General Zod into Doomsday, who's stronger than both of them put together. Fortunately, it turns out a mysterious lady whom Batman had been flirting with early in the movie is actually Wonder Woman, who shows up at the very end of the movie to punch Doomsday multiple times, buying Superman the opportunity to use Batman's kryptonite weapons to kill Doomsday but also get killed himself. With Superman now dead, no fucking really, Superman is dead, Batman and Wonder Woman decide to invent the Justice League in case anything like Doomsday ever happens again. Also, yes really, Superman is dead, but maybe he'll come back. Holy shit, now that I've said it out loud, I hate this goddamn thing even more. Everything from the characters to the dialogue to the plot points to the moment-to-moment storyline feels crammed in from somewhere else, with no amount of forethought, which means damn near every major element sticks out like a metaphor for how much this bloated, internally rotting corpse of a film doesn't work. No, really, it's so goddamn shit-curdlingly bad there are too many moments of self-symbolizing badness to choose from. The entire production is a full-blown, top-to-bottom, all-encompassing disaster rolling into theaters. Snyder's preference for photographing the masculine form like the bastard offspring of Robert Mapplethorpe and Vince McMahon means that Ben Affleck and Henry Cavill look alternately like giant bulging scrotums painted up like Easter eggs when wearing their superhero costume, and a pair of poorly tailored shaved gorillas wearing anything else. At one point, Affleck strips down to his slacks for a Rocky IV training montage that mainly involves pounding on a bus tire with a sledgehammer, because how can we expect to respect Bruce Wayne if we don't know that his CrossFit WODs are mad legit, bruh? Cavill is somehow even more stiff and unlikable here than he was in Man of Steel, rendered aloof and absent by an existential panic over whether or not he's actually doing any good that never manages to resolve itself. Though at least since he can generate action scenes, he gets off better than Amy Adams, whom the movie keeps trying and failing to find a place for with embarrassing results. During the climax, she nearly drowns trying to retrieve Batman's kryptonite weapon from a pool of water, which sounds hypothetically heroic until I tell you that she threw it the fuck in there herself a moment ago for no apparent reason other than the screenplay really needed her to almost drown. Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, however, gets off worst of all. This fucking guy might be the worst comic book movie villain of all time. Nothing about him makes sense, his personality changes from scene to scene, he's terminally obnoxious, for some reason we never find out exactly what he's about or what he does or even what his company is for when he's not doing bad guy stuff, and despite the fact that his actions drive the entire plot, we never get an answer as to why he's doing any of it. At first he says he hates Superman just because, then later he has a weird hang-up about God, then later he's mad at his abusive daddy, and then by the end he's barking about being aware of some unseen alien menace looming in the distance. At some points it feels like Luthor and the Joker were supposed to be in this movie, and then they mashed them into one character and didn't change anything. Oh, and that big title fight, it goes on for about 5 or 10 minutes tops, and it's mostly just a fist fight because Batman keeps hitting Superman with kryptonite gas that makes them evenly matched. And then Batman gives up because he finds out Superman's mom was also named Martha. No, for fucking real, that's not a joke. The incidental, oh, isn't that funny bit of comic book nerd trivia that Batman and Superman both had mothers named Martha is here treated as a huge goddamn revelation that fills Batman with so much empathy that he instantly wants to be Superman's friend and fuck this movie so hard. Oh, and if you're wondering about Justice League cameos, they're in there. Oh boy, are they fucking in there. You know how they typically do the world-building shit in the Marvel movies as post-credit scene or random background references, or organically integrated cameos that usually don't interrupt or detract from the main movie? Well, that's apparently too fucking subtle for Zack fucking Snyder. So instead, right in the middle of what passes for a pivotal scene in this shit pile, Batman gives Wonder Woman a hacked hard drive from Lex Luthor's place that's full of surveillance footage documenting the existence of herself, the Flash, Cyborg, and Aquaman. No bullshit, that's how they do it. Wonder Woman gets an electronic press kit and shows us all trailers for the next 4 fucking movies. But unlike Nick Fury showing up at the end of Iron Man, folks, this didn't feel like a promise, it feels like a threat. Not merely of more terrible movies, that's happening no matter what, apparently, but of some kind of cosmic balancing of the scales. Oh, did you really think the tendrils of nerd ephemera could ensnare and colonize the machinery of popular culture and there wouldn't be a downside? It's as though geek culture is being made to suffer for enjoying itself too much. Like we've gorged ourselves too gluttonously for almost a decade at the highest quality Avengers-catered buffet, and now Batman v Superman is the rock-hard, rectum-shredding, anus-prolapsing blockage we're supposed to be punished with for indulging too long without consequence. And if that sounded pretentious to you, you should hear the characters in this movie drone on about their own mythological significance with a humorless self-regard that perfectly fucking complements the droning faux Wagnerian percussions of the impossible to take seriously soundtrack and Snyder's increasingly garish aesthetic, which aims for Alex Ross, but lands somewhere closer to compositions you'd airbrush onto the side of a panel van. I could go on, folks, I really could, but by now I think you get the fucking point. Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is a travesty wrapped in a disaster inside an obscenity. It is a steaming, rotten, sun-baked, oozing shit. As a critic, I can't conceive that we'll see a worse major studio movie this year. As an observer of the film business, I'm perversely fascinated to know what happens next, now that one of the biggest studios on the planet has built multiple summers worth of release slates around follow-ups to what's turned out to be a Hindenburgian catastrophe. But as a comic book fan, I am suddenly feeling very, very old and tired. I imagine it won't last. I hope it doesn't last. But for now, yeah, tired would indeed be the operative motherfucking word.
Suicide Squad sucks. That needs to be said right up front on top of everything else because it's one of those peculiar movies where what's gone wrong with it is actually kind of goddamn fascinating, and parts of it are so completely wrong-headed that seeing them play out is unintentionally entertaining, compelling in its own right, which some folks will inevitably take as being some kind of an endorsement. So let me be completely unequivocally clear right now. Suicide Squad is a fucking garbage fire. It is excrement. It is a flailing, obnoxious, pointless, ugly, dreary disaster that swings wildly back and forth between incoherent and boring, and most of the time looks like it was shot through a solid wall of blood-clouded, kidney failure piss, which for a change means it's actually pretty goddamn appropriate for a feature that manages the neat trick of feeling all at once like an irritating wallow in the paint-huffing, waste-of-skin teenager version of anarchic excess, and an infuriatingly fake, phony, corporate mass-marketed co-opting of the paint-huffing, waste-of-skin teenager version of anarchic excess. It's the radio edit of a Kid Rock cover of an Iggy Pop track, the feature-length adaptation of a blonde, mullet-sporting 10-year-old shouting, "World Star" from the Chuck E. Cheese ball pit on Snapchat. Make no mistake, it is now utterly undeniable, what with the same goddamn shit going wrong with each successive terrible movie, that the DC Cinematic Universe is fundamentally broken and may be unsalvageable, no matter how good Wonder Woman looks. Unlike Dawn of Justice, which was loudly announcing that it was going to suck ass over a year in advance, Suicide Squad was looking like a good time. David Ayer knows his way around nasty dudes on a mission movies, the cast was interesting, the premise seems like a perfect palate cleanser for another superhero-saturated summer. Theoretically, these are all very good ideas. Unfortunately, whatever virus already took down Man of Steel and Batman v Superman has clearly spread through the entirety of Warner Brothers' ill-conceived extended universe experiment, as once again we have a movie that not only lands on screen stumbling around with its balls having been hacked off in the editing room, but also with just enough of what one presumes was the original vision still intact that you can tell it probably wasn't going to be even good before the suits took the scissors to it. Aesthetically, tonally, and quality-wise, the film Suicide Squad resembles more than anything else is Mortal Kombat Annihilation, and not just because of the terrible 90s style CGI used to create one of the main bad guys. The whole thing is a mess from top to bottom. There's no logic to the way scenes are arranged and play out. Some characters get introduced multiple times while others barely warrant having their names said out loud, which hilariously includes one of the main villains. Everyone seems to have 2 different personalities, 5 motivations, and at least 3 different backstories, and the only reason any of their interactions feel like something that might have worked under different circumstances is Will Smith, Margot Robbie, and Viola Davis
this are compelling enough on screen to make even the scattershot bullshit like this almost seem cohesive. Suicide Squad's big mission is to stop something that only happened because of Suicide Squad, and no one seems to bring this up as worth mentioning. Like, it's almost on the cusp of being a clever riff on the actual problems of covert paramilitary stuff, but it never comes up, and by the end it's like, oh hey, good job Suicide Squad, and you get the sense that a bunch of the movie went missing, or maybe the Incubus stuff was supposed to come in later, or maybe both, fuck if I know. To use the most prominent example, there's no reason for Jared Leto's Joker to even be in the goddamn movie. Seriously, after all that hype about what a weirdo he was during production, and how everyone on set was freaked out by his forced quirkiness, the Joker's only in the movie for about 10 minutes, and he doesn't even share the screen or interact with anyone in the main cast except for Margot Robbie, and even then it's only for one scene outside of Harley Quinn's origin flashbacks, which also don't need to be in the movie. Incidentally, since I know people are wondering, yes, Jared Leto is the worst Joker ever by a wide fucking margin. I'm not even talking about the look. I actually like the idea of taking Joker away from being a serial killer back to being more of a gangster, but more like a right now, skeevy, blinged out, druggy, modern type of gangster. But Leto just sucks at selling it. He's not interesting, he's not believably scary, he has no presence or menace or charisma, he's not even that bizarre. He's just boring and shitty, and assuming they're still making DC movies come Monday morning, they need to recast this part right the fuck away. This isn't just bad, it's actively fucking frustrating, and more so because you just know internet assholes are gonna be pointing to all the random shit that doesn't make sense and calling it edgy and different and visionary, when it's really just bad filmmaking with a flashy chip on its shoulder. But that's the problem with the whole stupid fucking enterprise. It aspires to trash, and then it can't cash the check. It rattles off the usual visual references to alternate geek bullet points like Takeshi Miike and Troma, and the usual direct lifts from John Carpenter and Joe Dante, but always in a soulless, calculated, coming soon to your local Hot Topic kind of way. It reeks of a cynical, desperate attempt to manufacture a kind of dirty, dangerous punk rock vibe without any real commitment or depth. Like a street team contracted by a marketing firm to plaster your local suburban strip mall with what looks like some out-of-touch executive's idea of what gang tags look like, but is actually just a fucking Mountain Dew promotion. That's Suicide Squad in a nutshell. The movie equivalent of stenciled graffiti. It's Breaking Bad branded rock candy. It's a vaping pen shaped like a crack pipe hawked on QVC by Flavor Flav. It's a gentrified neighborhood still trying to look street by putting a Boondocks mural next to the Panera Bread. And it's not even the good fucking version of that.
And the fallout from all that is the fallout from all of that. Zack Snyder and Chris Terrio's original Justice League pitch, the one initially set up in Batman v Superman, where it would have been spread across 2 movies, encompassing a post-apocalyptic, alternate future world where Darkseid kills Lois Lane, Superman turns evil, they take over the world, Flash does time travel to change history, Bruce Wayne gets Lois pregnant, and then he dies so Superman can raise him to be the new Batman. That gets thrown out in favor of being a terrible fucking idea around 2014, and Dawn of Justice tanks, and the studio starts insisting on rewrites and retooling of everything they've already started work on. We also just recently found out that the terrible rumors that started up around that time, which I don't think I mentioned in these videos, but was a thing, the Zack Snyder films were also going to make all of the magic and god characters in the DC movies Kryptonians, then just make everything about Superman. Yeah, that was a thing. That was apparently real. People were in denial about that for a while, and then Zack Snyder at SnyderCon, which is apparently a thing, just said, no, yeah, we were totally going to do that. So anyway, midway into this, Warner Brothers hired Jeff Johns and John Berg to come over and do producer oversight and rewrites across all the DC projects. Supposedly we're still a couple of years out from Zack Snyder getting sick of this and being fully pushed out for the lot, but it's coming. And also get Ben Affleck more involved on the writing and directing side of this, because at this point everyone is still planning on making what ultimately becomes The Batman as its own separate thing. Hence the production of this episode is my hypothetical about all of that. Just getting some timeline context here, since at this point we're producing these, we're getting information and news about behind the scenes shenanigans. A lot of it turned out to be wrong, including some of what's in these original episodes. Felt the context was important. Yeah, the renewed partnership with Screw Attack only lasted about 1 season of content, for which I was grateful. And after that I took In Bob We Trust Independent as a native channel incarnation of the big picture for the next few years. I'm including this episode from 2016 about how to fix Batman from that period, because A, we're looking at how the James Gunn reboot DC universe is shaping up on that front with The Brave and the Bold. It seems like maybe there's some, hey, I called that too, hindsight in there. I just kind of felt like this particular episode, I agree with a lot of stuff that's expressed here. It's going to come up again further. I still think I'm right about the Leonardo DiCaprio pick, by the way, at least in the sense of it being a good idea. I doubt he'd do it, but in that case, here's that.
Okay, so tempting as it may be to just cheat and say the first step would be throwing out the DC Extended Universe as a whole and starting over from scratch, that's not going to happen, and then this exercise would fully become fanfiction, and I'm not ready to hate myself that much. Besides, if left entirely to my own devices, I wouldn't make any Batman movie. What I'd make is a Robin origin movie where Batman is a supporting character, because Batman is Wolverine levels of overexposed at this point, and he's boring. So, if asked to decide the future of the DCEU Batman, my first edict would be to downplay the rest of the DCEU. Not ignore, not decouple, just don't bring it up if you don't absolutely need to, until such time as the rest of this mega franchise stops being a fucking garbage fire. Batman has a whole city, plenty of bad guys, a rich mythology of his own. There's no reason for Downer Man, Biker Mermaid, Sexy Cameo, Black Terminator, and not Grant Gustin to show up with all their bad movie baggage. They're out there, they're doing their own stuff, Batman is doing his. Second, we lose the brick shithouse look. If Batman is supposed to be this crazy acrobatic wall-climbing ninja, he shouldn't look like Brock Lesnar in between wellness policy suspensions. Tell Affleck to get back on the lean proteins, no more power armor. If it's really up to me, we go all the way back to the blue and gray with the yellow logo, but if people want to stick with the animated series color scheme, that's fine, not really the most important thing. Oh, also, no more built-in gear like in the Arkham games. Put the tools and weapons on proper utility belt, because Batman being a gadget guy is part of why Batman is fun. On that same token, Batmobile, no more fucking tumblers, no more tanks, enough of that shit. It's a car. He operates in a city, he's not Spider-Man, it makes sense he'd have just a car. So get a sick-ass real car, paint it black, put some Batman shit on it, now it's the Batmobile, and you can do chase scenes with awesome James Bond car weapons. And maybe it can, like, transform into a regular Bruce Wayne car for disguise, like in Viper, that'd be cool, right? Hell, it'd be a great promotional thing, have Bugatti and Lamborghini and all the auto companies compete for who gets to be the official designer of the fucking Batmobile. I mean, Bruce Wayne would know what a nice car is, right? Speaking of which, that brings us to the most important thing I demand. My Bruce Wayne would be a Bruce Wayne who is handling his shit. He's not over his trauma, because trauma doesn't work like that, but he's dealing with it. He's working it out. He's coping through a really effective, if unorthodox, coping mechanism called being Batman. But otherwise, he's not always waking up in a cold sweat, not everything reminds him of his parents, and even when it does, he deals with it like a well-adjusted person. Mostly. This is really important to me, folks. See, it's not just that tormented, vengeful, sadist Batman is played out and boring as fuck 3 decades out from Dark Knight Returns, I just feel like it's also become a toxic thing for fandom and pop culture at large. The whole dead parents thing is supposed to be tragic. It's the downer note that adds texture by underscoring what on the surface sounds like the most awesome life possible, being a billionaire and a superhero, but it feels more and more like many modern adaptations of Batman would rather fetishize Bruce Wayne's grief as part of some bullshit philosophy about how we need damaged, brutal, savage men to protect the world with their rugged individualism and blah blah. Enough of that shit. The DCEU Batman is already an older dude, so it's reasonable that he's learned some life lessons and can get stable. He's come out the other side, he's seen some shit that'll give you a new perspective, he's made some friends, and this results in a Bruce Wayne who's a chill guy, a cool guy, a guy you want to be. He travels the world, he spends his own money on philanthropy, he attends banging parties, he throws banging parties, he dates smoking hot chicks. If your kid wants Superman's autograph, maybe he knows a guy in Metropolis. Incidentally, what is Ben Affleck best at playing? Sharp, seemingly with it guys who secretly have something else going on. Also, the Batman side of things, going pretty okay too. He's been doing this a while, a bunch of the recognizable bad guys are already stewing in Arkham, because isn't that a great location and cast of characters you can just have on hand? He doesn't obsessively patrol every night, he goes out when he has to, or when the bat signal goes off. Maybe there's even a Nightwing or a Batgirl out there to pick up the slack, because why not? And Gotham City is, by now, pretty much okay with this, and accepts Batman as just a thing that happens. Yeah, I know Dawn of Justice was still doing the stupid Batman is Sasquatch thing, but who cares? That movie was trash, and if the DCEU does eventually start working, it'll be partly because subsequent films do their best to avoid talking about it. So we have a cool, fun Bruce Wayne, a Batman who kicks ass without always having to cry about it, and a stable enough status quo in Gotham City, which means the plot should logically concern something happening to disrupt that stability, something to throw this comfort out of whack, or at least threaten to bring it all down. You'd need a villain for that, obviously, but a villain who's different from your run-of-the-mill supercriminal, and preferably one we haven't seen in live action before. My pick, the Man-Bat. Why? Because I love the naming scheme, because a werewolf but for bats is a great creature concept, because by this point Batman will have met aliens and fish people, so all plausibility bets are off, and because it gives us a new plot template we haven't seen in a Batman movie before. This would be a monster movie, where the character who realizes there's a monster and has to figure out what's going on and stop it is also Batman. Now obviously there'd have to be some more to it than that. There needs to be a reason the Man-Bat shows up outside of we've never seen Batman fight a monster before. Maybe Hugo Strange creates it at the behest of some gangsters to tie Batman up with monster shit while they do a big heist. Maybe like a whole collection selection of the gangsta-type Bat villains, like Black Mask, Penguin, or the Ventriloquist. Maybe the Royal Flush Gang show up. Or maybe it's just been done to fuck with Batman personally. After all, a giant monster bat shows up flying around and killing people in Gotham City. Who's the first guy who's gonna get blamed for that? More importantly, who's the first guy people are suddenly gonna stop trusting again? You see, the plot is just rationales and MacGuffins and details to be filled in. What's important is the story, and in this case, the story is Bruce Wayne confronting the existential question of whether or not Batman, and thus he himself, is some kind of monster in the form of a grotesque living caricature of his own man-into-bat persona. Couple that with some world-building character drama and a handful of inventive action set pieces, and it's basically one dude versus one monster, so it doesn't have to cost 200 million fucking bucks either, and that's a fucking Batman movie if you ask me. Oh, one more thing. Since even the bizarre folks among you who somehow managed to enjoy Suicide Squad didn't like Jared Leto, I'd use this opportunity to recast the Joker. Figure out an excuse for him to look different later. Nobody really cares about the how of that stuff anyway. Just make him one of the guards in Arkham, put him in one of those Hannibal Lecter masks, don't dwell on him, keep him part of the furniture, don't make a big deal of him, don't even put him in any of the trailers, and don't reveal who's playing him until we see his face for the first time, preferably near the end of this movie. And the actor I'd cast? Leonardo DiCaprio. I know, but think about it. Nicholson put Dick Tracy-style Joker to bed. No one's gonna do anarchist mass murder Joker better than Heath Ledger. Florida Joker didn't work. Maybe super intense, charismatic, oddly handsome Joker is worth a shot. Plus, I mean, did you see The Wolf of Wall Street? He played a maniacal, superhumanly driven sociopath who builds a criminal empire out of nothing on sheer hypnotic charisma. And it's the best performance he's given in a career of really fucking good performances.
My killers who will not take no for an answer, who will not hang up the phone until their client either buys or fucking dies!
I honestly think he would kill at this part, and since he's expensive and busy, it would force Warner Brothers to not overuse the Joker. That's a win-win.
Now, as of this recording, we're staring down the end of what was at one point called the Arrowverse of DC shows on the CW, which finished sort of strong, I think, overall, even as the actual finish seemed to come out a few years ago, and then it kept kicking a bit because The Flash went on a bit longer, because it just did, and like a lot of things, it was almost entirely due to the pandemic happening in the middle of it, which we're still in the middle of, by the way. Like, I know we're not supposed to talk about that because the corporations need everyone to pretend that COVID's over so that everything keeps making money and we all just keep on rolling. But COVID's still out there, and it pretty much is the reason for everything that is weird about distributing movies, opening things, audience attendance, some things making money, some things still not. Like, that's the reason for everything. I know people don't like, you can't use a one-size-fits-all explanation for all things. When it's a global plague that kills millions of people, yes, you can. You actually can. That's why. Why are things different? COVID. Is there superhero fatigue? No, COVID. Are audiences sick of wokeness? No, COVID. Is it anti-wokeness? No, COVID. There was a plague. It did everything. Like, people don't ask this question about the 1940s. What caused this change or that change in the economy? World War II. The answer now is COVID. For the preceding 4 years and for the next, decade, COVID. Deal with it. We're gonna have to because our governments aren't. Sorry if that's too real. And also to have to use a douchebaggy phrase like, sorry for being too real, but in this case it's appropriate. Because that's what's happening. And anyone who tells you not is selling you something, which you should not buy. Anyway. Yeah, but at the time of this writing, that was what was really apparent going on in TV. This project doing its own thing, very separate from what the DC movies were doing the whole time, felt like a lot of what, right or wrong, people were constantly begging for out of the higher budgeted movie in the genre from both Marvel and DC in terms of a bigger variety of storytelling, diversity of characters, taking more chances on relationships, spending more time building out longer term stories, etc. was happening on the CW to mixed results, yeah, but even as we'll see, it eventually almost looked like it was going to sync up at some point, only for it to be cut down by, again, pandemic stuff. You have to wonder if it'll ever get the credit it deserves for getting first on so much of this stuff. And of course, being that it was 2016, you also had Wonder Woman coming out, so I'm including a preview episode of In Bob We Trust that was themed around that, and some of the audio from my review at the time, both of which are interesting artifacts, I think, in light of how that franchise also ended up.
I'm an absolute wish.
bottom line, this is where the tragicomic fall of the DC Extended Universe story really starts to play out via the, okay, Batman v Superman was a terrible thing that everyone hated, but we're already built up our whole brand around it and all these other upcoming movies, but at the time, all of that was overshadowed, especially where Wonder Woman was concerned, by the cultural shell shock of the Trump election. And what everyone knew was just this catastrophic wave of destruction and heartache that was about to be unleashed on the country, if not the world. I mean, I don't think anyone exactly predicted that so stupid they'd let a global pandemic spin out and people were gonna die because evangelical conservatives don't believe in vaccination. Look, you don't have to like Hillary to have grokked that a ton of the culture had been gearing up for at least 4 years of the first woman president business and what that was going to mean, and just the fact of Supergirl and Wonder Woman coming out on TV and movies when they did and the form they did tells the story of that, and the way they were received even more strongly than they might have been because the culture was looking for something meaningful to hold on to in that exact vein. Yeah, that's part of the story as well. You don't have to like it, but that's what it was.
So Supergirl's a pretty damn good little show, huh? Like, it's not a great show. I mean, if it was, they probably wouldn't have ended up having to move it to the CW, aka television's patron saint of pretty good TV. Not that being on a major network actually counts for much when it comes to genre series these days. I mean, holy shit, you ever watch Gotham? It's like somebody gave Dick Wolf a stack of shitty Batman comics and then a donkey kicked him in the back of the head. I know I'm supposed to couch this in some kind of backhanded irony, as if it only seems good because the Superman movies are just absolute garbage right now, or because Melissa Benoist's cute-to-hot ratio is balanced like a fucking Hattori Hanzo sword, but no, it's actually a good show. Granted, it probably doesn't hurt that it's by default the best thing anyone has done with a Superman-related license in live action since 1980. I mean, how much must it suck for Henry Cavill right now that he signed up to be Superman in what turned out to be two of the worst big movies of the last 20 years, and now he's stuck doing at least 2 more that, let's be honest guys, nobody actually expects to be any fucking good, and then this dude shows up for a 2-episode guest spot on a series whose production values claim to fame is that it usually looks a little more expensive than Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and basically flies rings around them. Now look, I'm not exactly giving away the secrets of the universe here by pointing out that the DC Extended Universe is thus far only good on television. I mean, if you start the clock at The Dark Knight Rises, which I promise you is somehow even more disappointing than you remember it being, there hasn't been a good DC Comics movie in like 5 years. That's a long time in the superhero genre. Hell, we've had 2.5 full Avengers movies since then, but this is really the first time in forever we've been able to compare a TV version and a movie version of the same property as contemporaries. Let's be clear, the show isn't really doing any straight-on version of any of the original comic versions of the concept. This isn't Golden Age Linda Danvers, it isn't Silver Age pre-crisis Kara, she isn't 80s Matrix Supergirl, she isn't 90s Peter David Earth Angel Supergirl, she isn't 2000s Apocalypse Supergirl, she isn't even whatever the hell her backstory is in the comics now. This Supergirl show is basically a Superman show with a gender-flipped lead. She's a reporter now, she's got a version of Perry White, she's got a female Luthor, she's got a version of Jimmy Olsen, she's got the actual Jimmy Olsen. Hell, even a lot of the major antagonists tend to be Superman foes. Bizarro, Metallo, Livewire, the Parasite, Cyborg Superman. So yeah, it's a Superman show, and it does the whole Superman routine so much better than the movies with seemingly so fewer resources, it's kind of embarrassing. So how are they pulling this off? Is there some special trick Supergirl's producers know that has somehow eluded Zack Snyder for 2 movies and counting? Well, I kind of think there is. Sort of. See, here's the thing with superheroes. They're kind of dumb. Look, it's a genre I love. I hope Marvel makes 100 more movies before everybody loses interest. I wish DC would get their fucking act together so I could see even more, but they're dopey. There's not really any getting around it. It's built into the genre, just like it is for monster movies, kung fu movies, softcore sexploitation, cartoons, and a whole lot of other stuff I really enjoy. They wear silly little capes, they have ridiculous weapons, they give themselves goofy-ass nicknames, they put their initials on their head, they fight with bows and arrows in the 21st century. It's goofy stuff. And while that goofy stuff is exactly what you were paying for, comic book to comic book, what made the great comics great was the storytelling and the humanity of the characters when those things were present. Perfect example, when the X-Men were at their most popular and culturally significant, the action and the villains and the plot points were some of the most ridiculous shit ever. Remind me to tell you about the Starjammers sometime, or Krakoa, the Living Island, or Arcade. Hell, like half of the justly beloved Dark Phoenix saga was just an extended inside joke about an old BBC show. Yeah, the big cool badass moments were there, but the reason that shit stuck in people's heads was the drama, the romance, the heartbreak, even the occasional whimsy. Look, there's a reason there was enough gas in the pop culture tank for 10 and counting X-Men movies, but only 1 Spawn movie. And it's not because the movies have been overwhelmingly good. In fact, apart from these 3, Spawn was actually better than most of them. Not getting this is why Man of Steel and Suicide Squad was so uninspired, and why Batman v Superman was so bad I think it gave me a psychosomatic bowel obstruction. They don't care about the humanistic storytelling that can get an audience emotionally invested. Instead, they try to make you take all the sound and fury superhero bullshit seriously. Instead of giving Bruce Wayne a recognizably human journey we can empathize with, they they want us to care about his stupid sequel teaser Darkseid nightmares. They give Lois Lane nothing to do because God forbid Superman or anything in his life become relatable or interesting, but then they expect us to get all wrapped up in the drama of Superman and Batman fighting because they've slathered a bunch of portentous pseudo-mythic gravitas all over it. This is what Supergirl, and to an extent the other CW DC shows most of the time, understand. Or maybe they just arrived at organically out of budgetary necessity, but whatever. You get your big dumb, goofy superhero moments like Supergirl and the Guardian fighting the Parasite, and they generally deliver the goods, but the show doesn't expect that kind of thing to be the center of the story. It's just the punctuation, the fireworks. The center of the stories are relatable, character-centric material, like Kara's sister coming out of the closet to her in that same episode. That's the stuff that sticks. See, also, this is the same logic by which Marvel knows that nobody actually cares all that much about the goddamn Infinity Stones. It's just a way to keep track of all the other movies. People keep coming back to the Marvel stuff because the characters keep connecting. Now, who knows if Supergirl can keep this pace up? As it is, they're burning through bad guys and reusable plot points from the Superman mythos at a surprisingly quick speed, but for now it's a fun series, and also an object lesson. If Warner Brothers wants these Justice League movies to stop being the laughingstocks of the blockbuster world, they could start by asking how they keep getting their lunch eaten by shit that runs on the same network that airs The Vampire Diaries. Well, hey, the weekend graced us with a new Wonder Woman trailer, a boon for yours truly who now doesn't have to think too hard about what to do on a Monday show after an exhausting weekend spent walking back and forth across the Boston Convention and Exhibition Center trying to play various video games a month or two early. You know, a Wonder Woman movie was always going to be a big deal, but this one has gradually morphed into being something like a great white hope for the entire superhero genre on multiple levels. It's the first female-led installment in said genre of the post-Avengers. This stuff is now the backbone of all global popular cinema era. It's the first time the DC cycle has beaten the Marvel movies to a landmark in forever, since their female-led movie doesn't hit for another few years, and speaking of which, it also looks like the first DC movie in forever that might not potentially be spectacularly awful and an affront to all that is good and decent, which is good news, even if it kind of looks like Warner Brothers might have finally gotten there by throwing up their hands and saying, you know what, fuck it, just smash two of the Marvel movies together and see if that equals something worth watching. And like everything we've seen of this character so far, trailer number 3 makes Wonder Woman look like a movie I really want to see, but it's also filling me with unavoidable concerns that Warner Brothers has managed to find a way to Martha this one up too. How? Well, same place a lot of attempts at making Wonder Woman work in modernity keep getting tripped up. The origin story. See, in case you didn't know, Wonder Woman's deep lore is really, really goddamn bizarre, and thus her origin story is really, really goddamn bizarre. As originally conceived by creator William Moulton Marston, Diana of Themyscira is not just an Amazon, she's a golem. No, really, Marston's original draft was a proto-feminist subversion of the myth of Hercules and the Amazon, where in the DC Universe version of Hercules was actually a villain and a huge asshole who enslaved and abused the Amazons, driving them to revolt and found a safe haven island free of all men. Being made immortal by the grace of their patron goddesses, the Amazons didn't need to procreate in order to keep their population up, but Queen Hippolyta decides she wants a baby anyway, and in lieu of doing things the biological way, makes one out of clay and bids the goddesses to imbue it with life. That's Diana, who grows up to be Wonder Woman. Little strange, right? For most of the post-Bronze Age of comics, DC has tried to either avoid, work around, or retcon the whole technically made of clay thing, frequently but with such little lasting success that I Have Too Many Origin Stories is now a key part of her origin story, the most recent variation thereof having retconned Diana to actually be the daughter of Zeus. That's the origin I think a lot of people assumed going in would wind up being used for the movie, and while that'd be, in my opinion, disappointing since it robs the character of some of her unique essence, it could be lived with, I guess. But bits and pieces in this new trailer suggest to me that the studio found a similar yet different solution that I really, really hope I'm wrong about. Now, to be clear, I don't have any special knowledge of the writing or other production aspects of this movie. I've only seen the same materials and heard the same rumors as everyone else. But let's look at a few things. Firstly, recall that we apparently still don't know who the film's main villain is. We know it takes place in World War I, Danny Houston is playing a bad German military guy, and Elena Anaya is a reimagined version of Golden Age Wonder Woman nemesis Dr. Poison. But in what might end up being the worst kept secret in comic book movies, legions of fans are already assuming, based on mountains of rumors, leaks, and hearsay, that the actual villain of the piece will end up being Ares, the Greek god of war. Assuming that's the case, it makes a lot of sense. Wonder Woman's rogues gallery is very obscure, so writers often use monsters and villains from Greek mythology instead. The premise of Diana having to thwart Ares from fomenting wars to service his own ambitions has been used several times in the comics and cartoons, and it would explain why the movie is set in a morally murky World War I, when Wonder Woman has traditionally been associated with the simpler white hat, Nazi hat dynamic of World War II. I.e., you can't really do the all war is bad, there's evil on both sides, that's why I fucked off back to No Boys Allowed Island until last year denouement that they're clearly building up to here, when you've got literally Hitler in the mix. Also, it gives her another superpowered person to have a proper battle with who doesn't require explanation because basically everyone has heard of the Greek gods. So, okay, some version of Ares is probably the main big bad, or at least the unseen person she's talking to at the end of the trailer here.
In the name of all that is good, your wrath upon this world is over.
Okay, fine. Not super creative, but fine. But what would that imply about the origin stuff? Well, alright, at the start of the new trailer, we meet baby Diana and find out that her mother is all about her not getting involved in the whole weapons of war business.
Who would wield it?
Only the fiercest among us even could. And that is not you, Diana.
Then, suddenly, she's all grown up and we get some shots of Amazon's whipping Diana into shape, which doesn't look like it'll be quite the same kind of fun that the comics traditionally implied, but oh well. But with more voiceover now implying that Diana has even bigger special superpowers of her own that she's not actually allowed to know about.
But she must never know the truth about what she is.
Which would seem to me to imply that wherever it is this version of Wonder Woman thinks she came from is not the truth, and that the real answer will be an important plot point. And given the evidence at hand, I'd say the big twist being telegraphed is that the baby daddy in question is Ares himself. I mean, that would make sense, right? She's not just a demigod, thus explaining the superpowers. She's a demigod sired by the god of war, hence the apparent reticence about letting her get involved with warfighting, even though she seems to be good at it and a little thirsty for it. This probably also means that Ares will be filling out the Hercules role in the deeper mythos, i.e. he's the one who oppressed the Amazons and drove them away from man's world in the first place. Narratively, that fits together pretty solidly, also potentially giving Wonder Woman a character arc of whether or not she'll be a pure weapon of war or something different, which settles nicely into a 3-act development structure. I just hope I'm wrong about all of this. Here's the thing. Yes, being essentially a Hellenistic female Pinocchio has always been the silliest, most awkward aspect of Wonder Woman's backstory, and it certainly wouldn't be a good fit with how very, very seriously Warner Brothers keeps insisting we're supposed to take these fucking movies. But it's also not hard to see that being a mythic fantasy figure literally born only of women fits into her broader mythology and the entire meaning behind her characterization. And even when they did this with Zeus as the father in the comics, to me it just feels like a huge step backwards to take a character whose sole creative conception was about female independence and empowerment and say, surprise, her story is actually largely driven and defined by her now all-important connection to a man, of course. Plus, hey, a superhero with father issues? That's new. And that might be the issue more than anything. If this did turn out to be where they're going, even if you set aside all the grade A problematic implications think piece bait this kind of scenario would create, the bad dad storyline is hopelessly played out and boring in this genre. What's particularly exciting about Wonder Woman as a franchise is that she's so fundamentally different in background and mythos from the other superheroes, in her universe or otherwise, thus negating the danger of her coming off as a token female Justice Leaguer. She brings something different to the table. Making her just one more strong person working out family drama takes a bunch of that away. So yeah, that's currently my worry about this movie. I hope I'm wrong, since the rest of it looks pretty damn decent. Either way, we'll find out in, about 90 days. Fingers crossed.
Holy shit! One of these things is finally good enough! Seriously though, folks, it's really only now just hitting me just where the punishing horribleness of the DC Extended Universe movies up to this point have led us to. Namely, the point where the barest minimum expectation of a releasable feature film being met feels like a series of miraculous achievements. Oh my stars! A recognizable 3-act structure! Saints be praised! Cinematography that doesn't look like high-contrast diarrhea! Holy Mary, Mother of God! Dialogue that sounds like it was written and spoken by people who've heard a human conversation before! Fuck me sideways! I can tell what's meant to be going on in well over half the scenes. Sorry, I really had to get that out of my system. I do think it needs to be acknowledged for posterity that a lot of the reason that Wonder Woman being a pretty damn good movie feels not just agreeable but downright cathartic is that it's been forced to shoulder the cultural ballast of a preceding franchise that's thus far been one of the film industry's great slow-motion disasters of the recent age. Which is unfair both because the mass ubiquity of the franchise era injures the ability of the film to stand on its own and because it forces the question of whether or not it feels like a good movie entirely on its own merits, or if it has at least some of the advantage of being the prequel, sequel, successor, whatever to one of the worst crimes ever committed against the art of filmmaking. For the record though, simply calling this better than the other 3 DCEU movies doesn't do it justice. Everything is better than the other 3 DCEU movies. Wonder Woman is a legitimately good movie all on its own. It's not a perfect one, it's not a game changer, but an absolutely solid superhero movie that occasionally flirts with greatness while sprinting through an overall pretty interesting story in terms of broader pop cultural import that more than delivers in what may be its most important mission, delivering a handful of showstopper action sequences wherein women, very possibly young girls in particular, who enjoy superhero movies, finally get to see a few built around someone a little more like themselves. And while that kind of means that conventionality, for lack of a better word, is kind of the point, i.e. Wonder Woman succeeding in action scenes that would have been right at home in the Captain America or Thor movies as the genre equivalent of gender integrating a previously
the all-male vocation, it also throws in some agreeably novel imagery, like an entire army detachment of men with guns being taken down by women on horseback fighting with medieval weaponry, and a whole lot of fun business with that magic lasso. Refreshingly, this is the first DC movie in forever that seems to embrace and understand the inescapable fact that the majority of these characters were fundamentally created for children, but it's more thoughtful than you might expect. The whole setup is very much grounded in original creator William Moulton Marston's original idea of a uniquely female version of strength being the curative for wars and violence brought about by men, just without being so explicit. Wonder Woman and the Amazons, we're told, exist specifically to thwart the machinations and minions of a male god of war, and all but one of the evil and or morally compromised folks in the film are men, so it's there if you're looking for it, just not super blunt. But what the film elects to do with that setup is give Diana a fairly different sort of character arc as these things go, where she has to start out with a very noble, optimistic ideal of what she's meant to be doing, why she's meant to do it, and what should happen if she does, lose that idealism upon realizing that man's world and human beings in general are actually kind of complicated and shitty and disappointing, but then overcome that disappointment, grow as a person, and do the right thing anyway. That's different. But unfortunately, since the film is also trying to fit a complete origin story and a here's all the cool stuff Wonder Woman can do highlight reel into just one movie, something has to give, and something ends up meaning the disillusionment and comeback arc that might have been more impactful spread out across the second and third acts instead gets compressed into a handful of scenes built around a last-minute twist that's really kind of easy to see coming. In this respect, it resembles nothing so much as the Phase 1 Marvel movies. Yes, in the sense that it's almost scene for scene the first Captain America crossed with the first Thor, but mainly in that it laser focuses on introducing and getting you invested in the title hero, and as a result, the rest of it is narrow-scaled and sort of runs out of gas for the perfunctory, underwhelming final battle against a disposable villain you don't really care about. Also, all the mythology stuff with the Amazons is over way too quickly. It was compelling, and I wanted to see more of it, but it delivers where it counts, and it already plays like a high watermark for this summer. The genre comparison thing is always kind of gauche and silly to me, but suffice it to say, it's not quite Richard Donner's Superman or the Avengers or the original Spider-Man, but it's right about level with Iron Man, Dark Knight, and First Avenger.
Yeah, so like I already indicated, this is really where the DCEU story starts to get interesting, but also where you start to get early signs that this is going to all end in tragedy. We're still smack in the middle of the Infinity War Endgame build-up on the Marvel side, making the cinematic universe concept work for the first time. All the other studios are scrambling to do it, and now you've seen the first attempt at directly mirroring it from Warner Brothers, since if Marvel and DC both had continuing brands concurrently as comics for decades, why not also for movies and multimedia for some reason? Basically falling flat on its face right out of the gate with Batman v Superman. But they'd already started making all of these Justice League tie-in movies. Wonder Woman was ready to come out. Justice League itself was into production. Ditto Aquaman. This was the beginning of watching a studio try to course-correct itself mid-flight. Always a bad idea. At this point, near as anyone could tell, Zack Snyder supposedly wrapped shooting on Justice League in late 2016, delivering a rough cut that the studio, bottom line, did not see as a clear departure from the movie they'd originally set out to make and now wanted nothing to do with. Depending on who you ask, Joss Whedon had already been working at Warner Brothers to write a Batgirl movie and is now doing Justice League rewrites on the side. By early 2017, he and Snyder are either working together or incorporating the changes Warner Brothers wants, or Snyder has already quietly left the project. Either way, his departure happens officially in May when he publicly steps back to be with his family following the tragic death of his daughter. Whedon and the studio will do 55 days of reshoots, effectively creating a whole new movie, and this is our coverage of the lead-up and results of all of that.
By the time most of you watch this, assuming it goes up on time this week, good God, November is a beast. I will more than likely either have seen Justice League, be on my way to see Justice League, or, during at least one comparatively brief stretch of time, be in the process of watching Justice League, and then I'll be writing a review of it to be released at some point after whenever that embargo drops. Basically, that's what my week looks like. Am I excited? Well, I'm interested, let's put it that way. How could anyone in my business not be under the circumstances? I mean, I'm still impressed to actually see a Justice League movie get made, period, considering how impossible that seemed just over a decade ago, and even if I wasn't interested in the subject or the genre, I'd be pretty fascinated to see this one anyway, given the backstory of the production, not necessarily the film. Here's a movie that was already into production when its direct predecessor, Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice was opening in theaters as what its studio thought for sure would be a gigantic blockbuster, and instead wound up being one of the worst reviewed movies of the year, one of the most divisive films among fans in its entire genre, and a record setter for Friday to Friday box office drop-offs. A film so controversially received and instantly infamous that my special Really That Bad episode covering it turned into 2 episodes, the first of which is already up, the second of which is coming soon, and I can now, somewhat exhaustedly, confirm that it will actually end up being 3 episodes by the time it's all done, because that's how the script sorted out, basically. Rumors swirled for months about Abject Panic, a studio trying to completely overhaul a massive shared universe production slate already in progress, including the partially made Justice League, originally planned as a 2-part feature shot concurrently, but now whittled down to just 1. On top of all that, midway into post-production, director Zack Snyder suffered a family tragedy and had to step away from the project entirely. With Joss Whedon taking over, launching even more rumors of massive reshoots, whole subplots being excised, radical shifts in tone. I mean, there's just no way that the story even ends here. We're all living through film history on this one, and that's pretty cool, even if it will almost inevitably overshadow whether or not the movie is any good. And yet, one thing I'm not looking forward to, fighting over whether or not whatever's been done to this movie in response to the last one is somehow a fix for the current mostly sorry state of the so-called DC Extended Universe, and especially its much maligned predecessor in particular. The fact is, what I wanted more than anything to avoid was to get wrapped up in the discussion of whether or not Justice League, if it turned out to be good, or even simply better than the last one, which, let's face it, is setting the bar about as low as you can possibly set it, somehow redeemed Batman v Superman. Because, and let me be clear about this, it can't. Here's the thing, even if Justice League or any other subsequent hypothetical related film did manage to drop in some kind of miracle retcon that explained away a nonsensical plot point or fixed a mischaracterization or particularly galling story point, that still doesn't actually ripple back in time and no longer make that element not a detriment in its original form in the original film. Yes, it might ease your sense of comprehension or make more sense when you're plotting out the beats and details of the DCEU meta-narrative on your own, if that kind of thing is your bag, no judgment here, but it can't undo the tangible negative effects of the original flaw on the original film proper. I don't care if Jeff Johns and Grant Morrison themselves collaboratively pen a stirring flashback monologue into the Green Lantern Corps movie wherein Tomar Ray reveals the shocking truth that Granny's peach tea was actually concentrated essence of the Parallax entity deliberately manifested into the Senate Superman hearing by Sinestro under the influence of Necron in order to create the level of fear and mistrust necessary to ensure Superman was distracted from preventing the deaths of Mercy Graves, Wallace Keith, and Judith Finch because the specific condition of their respective life energies fated them as ideal candidates to become the first Black Lanterns. It's still a stupid moment that sticks out and mutilates audience engagement with the narrative flow of the movie that it's actually in, and it would be no more retroactively fixed by that kind of nonsense than having them turn up as characters in Justice League fixes stopping Batman v Superman cold so Wonder Woman can watch Cyborg, Flash, and Aquaman's EPK teasers, which it can't and which it never could have because that's not how cinematic storytelling, even serialized cinematic storytelling, works. And furthermore, obsessing over fixing mistakes you've already made for the sake of either continuity, answering fanboy criticism of your previous movies, or just trying to prove you were listening instead of focusing on telling good stories going forward, or, here's a novel idea, making the one movie you're working on in the present actually good is a big part, hell, quite possibly the biggest part, of how we found ourselves in this mess to begin with. I mean, not for nothing, but it says quite a lot that the only one of these things that's been mostly good so far was Wonder Woman, and that's the one that felt the most like it could have been a standalone feature not connected to anything else. And even then, when it turns into a more familiar DCEU movie for the final big battle in terms of tone and style, that's kinda when the movie stops being good. Regardless, the stuff that didn't work in Wonder Woman and may or may not have worked at some point throughout the calamitous production and reproduction of Justice League is pretty much all stuff that was already poisoned before they inherited it from Dawn of Justice, and it's not hard to imagine that this will end up being the case with Aquaman too. The DC Extended Universe train, or whatever we're going to rebrand it as, has already left the station, and even if it's holding together now, I'm sorry, everything I've managed to glean from having immersed myself so completely in the fetid bowels of Batman v Superman tells me that the myriad cracks and profound design flaws in the engine are still going to blow the whole thing off the rails sooner or later if it maintains its current course. Can it be saved? I think so, yeah. I mean, that depends on what you mean by saved. If you're asking, will I ever see DC Comics movies again? The answer is of course. I feel like we're way past the point where this genre is meaningfully going away. The time period between Batman and Robin killing the superhero genre and the genre itself being zapped back to life by Blade was just 1 year. Time between Spider-Man 3 and Iron Man, also 1 year. You'll get your DC movies. Will they be part of the ongoing story established here? That's a little less of a guarantee, and if you're asking whether or not some narrative sleight of hand down the road retcon is going to make rewatching Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Suicide Squad not a soul-sucking waste of your time, no. The fact is, retcons are for making future stories better, not saving bad ones that already happened. So if and when Superman returns to these movies and suddenly they've figured out how to do the character well, a line or two of dialogue about learning lessons won't suddenly justify the 2 previous movies where he was an irritating sad sack, or make you right for having made excuses for them at the time. That's not going to happen, and making it happen should be the last concern on anyone's mind. That kind of fixating on connective tissue and trying to make up for previous mistakes over in-the-moment quality storytelling is a big part of how we got into this mess, which is why, even if, yes, I totally mark out for some kind of serious multiversal fan service stuff like Ben Affleck meeting Christian Bale and Michael Keaton, or a digitally reconstituted Christopher Reeve showing up with the gray Earth 2 Superman temples, or a walk-on from the Arrowverse people, I really hope they don't actually try to flashpoint their way into a fanboy pardon. Because look gang, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool geek going back way the hell farther from when I was doing this professionally, so I'm all the way down for shared universes, continuity, sequels, prequels, retcon, the whole thing, so long as it's always in the service of the movie you're making now, or the movie you're going to make next being the best it can be. Whatever you do to your timeline, you can only learn from past mistakes, not erase them, and trying to do so is how you end up with a blue Jamie Foxx or a purple Oscar Isaac. Let's not have any more of those, please.
So here's a movie that was already in production when they got the bad news that its direct predecessor, made by most of the same people and assumed to be a guaranteed success in the making, had instead opened as one of the worst reviewed films of its year, prompting a studio-wide panic and placing the rest of what was already a production state of questionable ambition in jeopardy and setting off a troubled production rumor mill that's continued to plague it to this day, most notably in the idea that what was supposed to be 2 movies and then at some point just became 1 for now, whose director stepped down from post-production owing to a tragic family loss, leading to the film being finished by another filmmaker, best known for similar features in a competing series, thus leading to further drama involving massive reshoots and more rumors of changes to tone, drastic shifts in story and pacing as its studio attempts, and in-motion course corrections. So, how is it? How do you think? The good news is, it's not horrible. In fact, it's almost tempting to call it passable or inoffensive until you remember how much they spent making this thing, or if you've got any attachment to the idea that the DC superheroes are meant to be anything more meaningful than just another super team, in which case it does not deserve to pass anything, and fans especially should be plenty damn offended. Ironically, it's nowhere near as bad as Batman v Superman was, but it's also 1,000 times less interesting than that, and I guess that's a better outcome. But for real though, at least that last dumpster fire blew itself up because it was trying and failing spectacularly to be about things like terrorism and power and hero worship and duty, sacrifice, martyrdom, whatever the hell that ending was supposed to mean. By contrast, Justice League avoids being a train wreck strictly because the train has nothing in the cargo and hardly anyone on board, and it's rolling along at about 1 mile an hour with no momentum until it hits a misshapen part of the track and just kind of stops, and there's no reason for anyone to care. The thinking on the post-production side here is clearly that releasing a dud was preferable to risking another disaster, and that basically means you're watching a film where anything that wasn't a joke, an action scene, or a character striking a dramatic pose for their merchandising stills just doesn't exist. Functionally, Justice League is the cinematic equivalent of a cheap fiber supplement. It has no taste, no texture, and it's only designed to pass harmlessly through the plumbing and make you feel like you experienced something. There's zero thematic or narrative connective tissue holding anything together. The characters show up and leave, chemistry comes and goes with no rhyme or reason, motivations and attitudes change just because, and even the biggest possible plot point the film could have possibly hit shows up at midpoint with no real build-up, hits the pause button, and then resolves itself with very little explanation and an absolutely staggering lack of gravitas, reduced to just another plot point to get off the checklist so we can keep this damn thing under 120 minutes. Whatever Zack Snyder originally intended Justice League to be, Warner Brothers has released in the form of a mercilessly chopped down and hilariously recolored and retouched film that lands as a nearly plotless, uninvolving highlight reel, and not even a highlight reel of the mostly one-dimensional characters as they exist in the film, but rather a collection of sizzle clips and money shots designed to say, yeah, you see what he can do? Now imagine that, but with an actual movie going on. Justice League is far from the worst film I've seen all year, but that's only because it's not trying hard enough to fail hard enough. It's an infield foul in T-ball. Strictly on its own merits, it's a complete waste of your time, but as a cultural artifact, it's a waste of millions of dollars, several good actors, a bunch of intermittently good filmmakers, and the legacies of several beloved comic book characters. 1.5 stars. Yeah, I know we're all gonna go see it anyway, but there's really no reason to. The theatrical cut of Justice League came and went in 2017 as basically a whatever release swallowed up by the midpoint boom of the MCU Phase 3, and by this point the writing was pretty much on the wall with Snyder out, and the train was off the tracks. Whatever happened next, there was going to be big changes. At the time, it was pretty much obvious. All the movies except for Wonder Woman, so Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, and Justice League had either been box office failures, critically ravaged, or both. The whole project was a disaster. And not like the crying actor face, big yellow letters, go woke, go broke, YouTube moron, fake studio in trouble kind of disaster where one of the Marvel movies doesn't make $1 billion and dumbasses jump up to pretend that means everything is over because, it's good for their traffic spike or whatever. I mean real disaster, the kind that ends jobs and kills studios, and everyone knew it. The only question was what's gonna happen with Aquaman, and at the time, nobody was paying attention because, it's fucking Aquaman.
My ability to talk with fish is of no help, Wonder Woman.
Now, something else that happened in this time frame that doesn't really show up in these retro episodes until much later, if at all, because the actual results from it played out now very much in slow motion, is that a few months prior to the film's release in November 2017, Joss Whedon's ex-wife had basically ended him as a public figure with a guest column about how his supposed feminist credentials, which had always been just this huge part of his whole brand, were bullshit because he'd been cheating on her, treating her like shit, and carrying on harassing every woman in his professional orbit for like decades. And yeah, it was pretty bad and kept getting worse. So that was also hovering over all of this, though not necessarily part of these episodes, because that's not generally a beat that I covered on these shows. So if you know what was what, you knew Ben Affleck had bailed on the whole thing months before Justice League came out, and they just couldn't say so yet. It doesn't come up in these videos either, because by this point, Warner Brothers have been trying and failing to make The Flash movie even longer than the rest of this, so that movie, having hired and fired about 4 directors and a dozen writers during this whole process, basically passed without notice until right before Justice League came out, and reports broke that they were scrapping the whole idea of doing a solo Flash movie as planned, and instead were making Flashpoint, which in the comics was a storyline used to reboot the DC continuity, and then it clicked for everyone. Oh, that's how they're gonna do it. They're gonna use the Flash movie and give themselves a do-over. The only piece yet to fall was whether or not Henry Cavill would still be Superman or not. Now, at this point, here in the present, we know he was long gone from all of this and remained gone, but for a variety of reasons, we all had to pretend to draw out the question for a big game of mystery make-believe for 6 more goddamn years, but the coverage of it and me teeing up a bunch more retroactive told-you-sos for this whole retrospective here starts right here in this next set of episodes in 2018, which also saw me revive the big picture at the New Management Escapist. One of those will be the second of the 2 videos you see. The first is an excerpt from a podcast-style version of In Bob We Trust that we kept running on the Independent channel during the first few months of Big Picture, just to manage the transition.
Okay, I guess we'll talk about Henry Cavill as Superman, since I'm recording this, overnight on, I guess it was Thursday, now it's Friday. So who knows if this will change or not. This will, unless something major happens, this will probably end up being Monday's Big Picture in some way, so you just want to skim it a little bit. But, so we think Henry Cavill is out as Superman. Like, realistically, I don't want to be like, Mr. Hollywood inside baseball guy, because one, I'm not a Hollywood inside baseball guy. Like, barely. I'm mostly hearing the same kind of, like, scuttlebutt and third-hand stuff that everyone else does, if lucky. Other entertainment reporters, writers, critics, etc. People do talk to each other. But if you do follow filmmaking, if it's your job to follow this side of the business, and you know the way that things like this have happened before, if you've seen, I've been doing this for a long time, feels like a long time at least, and you've seen projects like this rise and fall, come and go and whatnot, you kind of get used to the way the news cycle works, you know a little bit about how the industry plays out. Realistically, no one ever wants to say, oh, I know right now exactly what's happening, because things really can change right away. But if you were a betting person, if you were like in Vegas laying odds on what kind of business decisions were going to happen vis-a-vis the making of Warner Brothers superhero movies, which, by the way, you can bet on anything in Vegas, and people do actually bet on stuff like this. You can actually make, like, official, listed bets on things such as this. You can, like, call up and get odds on stuff like this. It's really bizarre. How sad must that be to be someone whose job it is to, like, monitor that kind of thing. Oh, you're in the business of gambling betting. Are you keeping track of like horses or football or fights? No, I'm trying to see who's playing Superman this month. That's what I do. That feels, I don't know, that sounds like dystopian to me in some way. That sounds like a parody of dystopia. So if you follow the business closely and you've seen this kind of thing happen before and you watched the production of Justice League and the way that it came out and, Zack Snyder having to leave the production and all of the business coming onto it, as soon as that business started going on with this thing where we were pretending that the reason Henry Cavill had to have the digital stuff done to his face in Justice League was because he couldn't find the time to shave his mustache from the Mission Impossible movie to come back, like when they were pretending that was an unsolvable problem that would prevent him from coming and working on this movie, as opposed to just, no, I don't want to, this isn't that important to me. That was the point at which you knew that he was probably not going to put on a Superman costume again for Warner Brothers. Like, anything can change. Anything can change. These things do happen fast. When the cast photo got taken of the Avengers, the last big photo before they cast Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange, the reason Benedict Cumberbatch, or rather Doctor Strange in period, is not part of that cast photo is because hours before they had everyone on stage to take that photo, Joaquin Phoenix had just finished saying no to playing Doctor Strange. They had him on for yes. He said, yeah, sure, I think I'll do that. And then he said, no, I don't think I will. And that was the end. And it was going to be like this big thing and then not. So these things can change like that. But at that point on Justice League, with all of that stuff falling apart, as soon as they were saying, no, you know what, we're cutting from 2 movies back down to 1. No, you know what, we're going to cut references to Darkseid. We're just going to scale it on back. We're thinking about not doing to be continueds on this one. You kind of knew that things were grinding to a halt and that the plans were off, that they weren't going to, the SnyderVerse was basically over. And that with that, if you had to place bets on stuff, your safe bet would have been Henry Cavill is not going to be Superman again, Ben Affleck is not going to be Batman again, that they were going to probably finish Aquaman and see how that goes. And I still think Aquaman looks pretty good, we'll see, because they have Jason Momoa already making that movie, but everything else up in the air. And right now it looks like, we're getting reports in now that Henry Cavill is out as Superman. The thing is, you can never fully believe this stuff because there's this thing in the industry called negotiating in the press, which basically means because nothing is official until there's a statement, anyone who wants to, who has sufficient juice or the ability to get it in there, can call someone that they know in the press up and say, hey, I've got a story for you, and then it gets in there, and it can be seen as putting pressure on a studio or on a casting agent or on an actor to do something. So who knows what's going on there? This could be Warner Brothers saying, hey, Henry, we are okay getting rid of you if you don't stop, making demands and, shave your damn mustache next time. But it looks like he's out of this movie. This could be his agent trying to get more money. That seems to be what a lot of people are saying. His agent has been back and forth on Twitter and social media with quotes saying, no, he's definitely still playing Superman. Supposedly, this is like talks breaking down on him not being able to find time in his schedule to do a cameo in the Shazam movie. And Warner Brothers has been saying for months, basically making talk about negotiating in the press, making threats that, we'll just go ahead and make a Supergirl movie. That's our priority. And this would, to be clear, this is not like a movie of the Melissa Benoist TV show Supergirl. They're not doing the connecting the TV vaguely to the movies thing like Marvel sort of does. They're keeping that completely separate. They want to do a Supergirl standalone movie of a different version of the character. They've been saying that's going to be our priority instead of a Superman movie, and that we don't have plans to make another one. That is more or less seen as a threat to do that instead of Superman, as a way of saying, dude, Henry, we don't even need you, so, maybe stop being such a diva about this. Who knows? I do think that if it comes to pass that Warner Brothers is serious and they're not going to make a new Superman movie right away because of Supergirl, stranger things have happened. The bottom line for Henry Cavill is I do think he's out. We aren't hearing it officially yet because who knows, they might drop a dump truck of money on him. It's unlikely that they'd get started on anything because he's going to go off and make The Witcher, which sounds like a very kind of labor intensive thing that would take him away from doing anything for a while. He's not getting younger. These are very physically intensive projects. They're going to want a younger actor period to get in on this. They keep casting younger for these things. The running joke that a lot of people have been going with is that it's a surprise that he got out before Ben Affleck. He's not out before Ben Affleck. Ben Affleck has been out for well over a year. The reason that you're not hearing that Ben Affleck is out, again, more studio inside baseball stuff, Ben Affleck is back in alcohol treatment right now. He's back in rehab. I'm not telling any jokes about this. There's nothing funny about that. that he's back in. He has a lot of serious struggles ongoing for a long time with alcoholism. He's back in treatment for it. I hope it works out for him. They cannot legally, under his Screen Actors Guild Award rules, fire him or remove him from this project until he's out. Like, that's on hold. That's like, he is going to be listed as Ben Affleck, still under contract to play Batman, at least until he's out of that. They're still going to make Wonder Woman movies. They've got Gal Gadot on. That's the only unqualified success that they've got. Aquaman, I'm sure that they're on a wait and see. I would not be surprised to see, they've already started talking about that the Cyborg movie would cost about $200 million. That was the news. They didn't say we're not going to make one. They didn't say we're still proceeding ahead, but they said that would cost $200 million, which is a really kind of sort of dickish way for them to imply in the press, guys, really, does anyone want a Cyborg movie? And Ray Fisher has a lot of prospects as an actor. He doesn't need this bullshit. It's a tainted brand. He needs to go. Ezra Miller seems like they're kind of trying to keep around for The Flash, someone who should be trying to find a way out of this, because I don't really get Ezra Miller as like an actor. I don't see what the big appeal is, but so I don't really see the appeal, but right now clearly fits the bill as what Hollywood sees as the young lead. So why sticking with a loser brand like the DCEU right now? I have no idea. What's genuinely amusing to me is if all of this stuff actually comes through, if Cavill completely out as Superman, Affleck out as Batman, and the takeaway here is what now seems to be Warner Brothers' real plan is that we're not going to do Superman. We are not in a huge hurry to get the Matt Reeves, the Batman, underway because Affleck's probably out and we don't know who's going to play him. So instead, we're doing Supergirl movie. We're going to do Wonder Woman 2 that is almost certainly going to, since they don't have any Justice League team-up movies or whatnot to lead into, almost certainly the to-be-continued post-credits thing on that will be Wonder Woman 3 coming soon. They've got Birds of Prey, a.k.a. the Harley Quinn movie coming, the Batgirl movie that may or may not spin out of that was supposed to be the thing Joss Whedon was going to do, but is now its own thing. And the next big CW DC push is the Ruby Rose Batwoman show. I mean, if you look at all of that, it looks amusingly like you really can't take that as anything other than Warner Brothers looking at their balance sheets and saying, well, the only one of these that worked and that anyone liked was Wonder Woman, so you know what? Fuck it. This is the chick superhero brand now. We're gonna fuck Batman, fuck Superman, we're gonna do Supergirl, Birds of Prey, Batgirl, Batwoman. That's what we're doing now. I mean, we've got Aquaman and we got Shazam because we already made those, so whatever, but like Mera, you're now the co-lead of Aquaman, that's a thing. This is like that seems to be the angle on it. And I mean, hey, cool. That's pretty interesting. That's everyone is looking for the way to differentiate themselves from Marvel in this kind of stuff. But it seems kind of quintessentially Warner Brothers that the way that they got into this mess in the first place is that rather than, kind of take their time and just make individual good movies and figure out how to fit them together as they went, they basically they basically committed to a 10-year plan, this big elaborate 10-year plan based on, okay, what is really, really hot in superheroes that as we're setting up our big universe right now is really big, weird, sort of auteur-driven, dark and angry 90s fanboy-pleasing stuff somewhere in between the Watchmen movie and the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. So let's make those, and we're going to rush ahead on a 10-year plan based on that vision of the DC universe before asking whether or not anyone wanted that or if it was going to work. And now that hasn't worked, and now that they had, Man of Steel, which was divisive and didn't age well, and Batman v Superman, which was a disaster, and Justice League, disaster. Suicide Squad made money, but a dud creatively, and, has really done nothing for them other than, get everyone to agree that Margot Robbie looks hot as Harley Quinn, what a shock, and that people would pay to see a whole movie of that, duh. So now, rather than look at that failed experiment of rushing ahead based on whatever was momentarily hot and making a huge plan and overcommitting to it, Warner Brothers seems to be ready to do the same thing again, where they looked at it and said, okay, what is working for us right the hell now, right in this moment, and what's working for them right the hell now in this moment is Wonder Woman and the CW shows, and they've looked at that and said, well, okay, we're going to commit to the far-flung future of this franchise is exactly that, so greenlight a whole bunch of movies and let's go, and we hope it works. So they had one hit female-fronted superhero movie, so that is what they're going to do for the next 6 or 7 movies is that, and hope that works. So even when they have a good idea, it seems like this studio cannot not overcorrect. So depending on when you watch this episode, the big news breaking over the weekend in the world of geek culture was apparently we're still using the word geek culture to refer to massively popular multimedia entertainment properties consumed by people of almost every conceivable background all over the world, thus in fact representing the most widely applicable version of the term mainstream culture in human history out of a pointless and quite frankly sad commitment to artificially constructed consumer tribalism. Wait, sorry, that's not news, that's just a depressingly omnipresent fact. Anyway, the news is, or perhaps was or was not, that actor and/or expertly crafted jawline with a Screen Actors Guild card, Henry Cavill, the guy from Immortals, is or will soon no longer be playing the role of Superman in Warner Bros. DC Extended Universe motion picture franchise. Or maybe he still is, or maybe not, or maybe his agent is negotiating in the press, or maybe nobody really knows because we're talking about expensive blockbuster casting decisions and nobody really knows anything until you see an official press release, and even then, yeah, good luck. The difference between movie studios and the government is that sometimes people in government lose their jobs when they get caught in a lie. To be realistic, even if you're in the camp that felt failing to give anything resembling an emotionally resonant performance across 3 whole films wasn't in any way the actor's fault in this case, the only real surprise here should be that it took this long. Warner Bros. DC Extended Universe experiment has been a slow-motion train wreck since the moment Zack Snyder and the Nolan brothers' glum, brooding Man of Steel trudged its way into theaters 5 years ago and was followed by the divisive and critically panned Batman v Superman, the widely mocked and also critically panned Suicide Squad, and the box office disaster of Justice League, with the only unquestioned bright spot coming from Wonder Woman, buoyed by a legitimately star-making turn from newcomer Gal Gadot and an underserved audience in particular need of a morale boost for reasons. These are circumstances where even a studio as recently familiar with loss as Warner Brothers typically starts to say, okay, we've got mostly losses, which ones can we cut and how soon? This all comes after nearly a solid year of on-off speculation that Ben Affleck was closer and closer to abandoning the Batman role following appearances in many of those same poorly received movies, stepping down as director of the proposed solo Batman movie, and one can only speculate, someone, perhaps old friend Matt Damon, leading a daring covert infiltration of Warner Brothers' highly guarded top-secret tower fortress to destroy the mind-control broadcasting apparatus that had been convincing him to make these movies in the first place, at which point Affleck awoke and asked himself, wait a minute, I'm 46 and successfully transitioned to an Oscar-winning directing career. Why am I doing this? In all seriousness, it's very likely that Affleck is also out and has been for a while, but you won't hear about it officially because he is currently undergoing a voluntary stint in rehabilitation for help with alcoholism, and the Screen Actors Guild Union forbids a movie studio production from ending an actor's contract while they're undergoing treatment of that type. This is a very serious issue that the actor has made no secret of a very public struggle with for many years. I have zero jokes to make about it, and yeah, that's it. No joke here. That's a really tough thing for anyone to go through. It's gotta be tough on him, very tough on his family, and I hope he and they come through it okay. Really rooting for them. In any case, it does look pretty clear that Henry Cavill is probably not going to be keeping the Superman role any longer, if for no other reason than the studio hasn't shown any real interest in getting another movie about Superman going anytime soon. There's been zero talk of a follow-up to Justice League, a film that was originally announced as a 2-part feature, no commitment to a proper sequel to Man of Steel. In fact, the latest talk of Cavill hanging up the cake for good came about mainly because he's either been unavailable, uninterested, or both in a Superman cameo in the upcoming Shazam movie, a co-production under Warner Bros. New Line Cinema banner that was originally not announced as being connected to the continuity of the DCEU and still hasn't officially been confirmed as such, although its trailer seems to make the case that it is. Instead, the studio has mostly been keen to talk about shifting the franchise focus to a Supergirl movie, one that would feature a new DCEU teenage version of the character separate from the 20-something version played by Melissa Benoist on the hit CW series, which is now entering its 4th season. That, plus the Batgirl movie previously being scripted by Joss Whedon, now apparently revived by Bumblebee screenwriter Christina Hodson, the Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn headlined Birds of Prey movie still on track, Amber Heard's Mera being effectively elevated to something like a co-lead in Aquaman, and the next major CW TV push being the Ruby Rose Batwoman series, all seem to indicate that the movie studio that got into this mess in the first place in part by, instead of attempting to make several different good films each according to the needs of the individual project and fitting them together as they went, looking at what was momentarily trendy in the superhero genre right at that specific moment in time and saying, okay, this is hot right now, that means it'll be hot forever, so let's irreversibly launch a decade's worth of expensive projects all based on aping this relative tone and texture, will now proceed to try and get out of the hole that decision put them in by doing that exact same thing again. Seriously, Wonder Woman was the only thing we made everybody didn't hate? Okay, screw it. DC is now the lady hero brand. Yeah, we're doing Supergirl, Batgirl, Holly gets her own movie, let's go and get these contracts signed, people, because apparently there is no correction like an overcorrection. And hey, I've heard worse ideas. You've got to differentiate yourself from Marvel somehow after all, assuming, hey, we're the superhero universe that didn't get tricked into firing the best director we've got under contract by internet weirdos with a political axe to grind doesn't cut it. And then again, maybe Hopefully it won't be quite that extreme, since they've still claimed to be making that Flash movie and the Cyborg movie. I really kind of doubt that either of those actually happen, but we'll see. The most interesting aspect to come out of the whole news cycle was, of course, the separately emerging storyline of Michael B. Jordan being the first actor whose name started to circulate as a potential Superman replacement if and when Cavill is officially out of the role. Let me say up front, I think that would be very interesting casting, and while I think it would necessitate taking a second look at the overall approach to how the character has been approached traditionally, I don't think there's any insurmountable problem with the idea of a black Clark Kent or a black Superman, or that he should just play John Henry Irons instead, or that if he doesn't, it means there can't also be a John Henry Irons as well. I'd be really surprised if this was something that was under active consideration, though, as opposed to Michael B. Jordan has a very good agent who knows how to get his client's name into the weekend news cycle. Warner Brothers wants you to remember that they're releasing Jordan's next big movie, Creed 2, this holiday season, especially if, as many in the industry increasingly expect, he nets a Best Supporting Actor nomination this year as part of Disney's extremely aggressive Oscar push for Black Panther, or some combination of the two. I can even see Warner Brothers wanting him for a DC movie, and I can see him wanting a franchise of his own. I just can't imagine a young actor with as promising a career as he has right now signing on for a role that just claimed victim number 6 in the "if you play this role, your career gets horribly derailed" cycle. I do absolutely think that casting non-white actors as historically white heroes is going to be the next logical step for franchises like this in the very near future. It's worth noting that Warner Brothers actually offered the Superman reboot that eventually morphed into Superman Returns to Will Smith originally, who claims to have turned the project down in part because he was still shaken up by the level of anger he drew from some white audiences for taking over the role of Jim West in the Wild Wild West movie. They've already recast Aquaman with Polynesian and Native American actor Jason Momoa without much criticism on that front anyway, and if nothing else, limiting yourself to only one type of actor because that's how they drew these made-up people at one point is kind of a silly reason to cut yourself off from vibrant and up-and-coming talent. So yeah, sure, I'm immediately more interested, if only nominally just so, in a female-centric DC universe or a black Superman than I am in another retread at this point. Bring it on, fine, every little bit helps, but it's a little troubling that we're hearing about this and not so much the prospects of what directors might be considered, what writers are being sought, what creative direction is being set up for the course correction, if any. Having been in Hall H at the San Diego Comic-Con this past year for the DCEU presentation, I can tell you that the reason the Wonder Woman 2, Aquaman, and Shazam footage all went over so big was that they all looked like big, refreshing, complete departures from what they'd been offering so far. Yes, even Wonder Woman 2 looks like a complete tone shift away from the first movie. Until we see that become the focus, it's difficult to imagine that anyone in charge of this has really learned anything. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.
Incidentally, that Black Superman movie, possibly with Michael B. Jordan at some point, supposedly morphed into a separate thing entirely, which may or may not have been an Elseworlds project like The Batman, based on the DC character Calvin Ellis, a Superman from another timeline where he is black and also President of the United States. This was in development from a script by Ta-Nehisi Coates and J.J. Abrams, apparently going to direct it. They've been saying until very recently that that was still on the table, but nobody's heard anything in a while. Most recently, James Gunn seems to think that it still might get done. Honestly, I hope it kind of does. It sounds interesting, more so maybe with a different director than fucking J.J. Abrams, but, maybe, who knows? Anyway, something else that happened during the first half of the one-term Trump administration in the film business. Can I say that again? One-term Trump administration. From here in the present, shouting back to the past, thank God. Anyway, something else that happened during the first half of the one-term Trump administration, business adjacent to all of this, was the James Gunn fiasco at Marvel, where a bunch of right-wing neo-Nazi internet goblin shitheads staged a fake outrage campaign and basically gamed the social media algorithm to get James Gunn, then best known as director of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, fired off the third film and, depending on who you ask, displaced as overseer of the cosmic side of the MCU in 2016. This then became part of the DCEU story 2 years later, when Warner Brothers hired him to write and eventually direct the soft reboot of Suicide Squad, and then the rest happened and now he's running the whole fucking studio. Yeah! And that's what you call some fucking justice. But at the time, not a great decision on Marvel's part, which they clearly realized since they did rehire him, but yeah, I did a lot of coverage of the James Gunn debacle on the channel. I was a very vocal supporter of the rehired James Gunn movement and so on. I'm not including all of that here because really only this next Suicide Squad in Bob We Trust episode and the subsequent episode where Marvel reversed course and reinstated him for Guardians 3 are relevant and also had additional info and history, but yeah, that was part of the story, unfortunately. Plus, right in the middle, we got the release of Aquaman, where you'll find the review audio here confirming that I was exactly as surprised as anyone that this was good, and then it went on to be an actual major hit for the first time in forever for this franchise. So that, plus Gunn getting a new big job and his old job back for one more movie, me also being high on having the big picture picture back as discussed in the included Christmas episode here, it was almost feeling like things were maybe turning around. For at least a minute there.
So I guess I gotta do a thing about James Gunn writing and probably directing Suicide Squad 2, right? Since I've done 2 or 3 videos about what went down for him in Guardians 3 and that ongoing bullshit with Marvel and Disney basically giving into a totally fake fucking thing made up by internet Nazis that seems to have worked pretty much because Bob Iger was on vacation that week. Not that I don't want to, I do. What I mean is I've got to do one now instead of waiting for the other shoe to drop, i.e. finding out what's going to happen to Guardians and Gunn's script and who's actually going to direct that movie now, even if it happens. Basically, I wanted to wait until there was an actual statement from James Gunn or Disney on any of this, or at least for the mouse to finalize the new leadership position shuffle, i.e. who's going to be in charge of what once the merger with Fox goes through. More broadly is that Disney's next big move immediately following the merger is a massive pivot to streaming initiative that'll see them put more focus than any other A-list studio on their new in-home streaming service as a primary release platform for new content, as opposed to theaters or their regular TV channels. And that's a high-risk but maybe high-reward gambit. He's probably not going anywhere, which might be why we're seeing possibly James Gunn definitively moving on to another studio or project now, and likely not coming back for Guardians 3 as director, which of course would have had to have been in the works, at least as an option for a while now. This isn't something that would have happened within a week, like, oh hey, we just had this crazy idea, what if James Gunn did Suicide Squad 2? Let's give him a call, see if he's available. No, this is something that's probably been back and forth for a while, we just haven't heard about it. But that's corporate stuff, we'll see what it ends up meaning or doesn't, who knows. How do I feel about Gunn doing Suicide Squad 2? If it goes through, I think it's a fucking great idea, and I'm happy as hell for him. I want to see good movies happen under whatever circumstances they happen, and I want to see good, talented people in the movie business continue to get jobs so they can do what they love and make a living on it. I don't give a shit on Marvel versus DC, studio versus studio, Disney versus Warner Brothers, corporations smashing their money together to see who's dick is. I don't give a shit. Alright, I don't care. You know, like the comic book store guy version of it, of, you know, which character would beat up which character, or whose books do you like better is one thing. That's fine. That's a hobby, weekend, chat over drinks thing, fine. You know, there's like an aesthetic discussion to be had, at least there was at one point, about, you know, the reigning Marvel aesthetic versus the SnyderVerse aesthetic when that was the DC Universe thing, and approach versus approach. But those are like, you know, esoteric pie-in-the-sky things. I'm not invested in some kind of, like, movie dork Bloods and Crips bullshit over Marvel versus DC. I want to see good movies get made. You know, people have got this whole thing wrapped up in their identities where you're a Marvel fan, or you're a DC fan, and you're committed to this side, and you're gonna ride or die for it, and it's such fucking bullshit. Are you seeing any of the money from this? Like, is this enriching your lives in any way? I mean, if you like the movies and you enjoy them, then yes, they are. But, like, is there financial success? You know, is Alan Horn getting to add another wing to his fucking house benefiting you? Really? Like, I care about what happens to James Gunn because I like him as a filmmaker. I respect his biography as, you know, where he's come from, where he's going. You know, he's been a filmmaker that I liked before he was involved with Marvel. I plan to like him after he's involved with Marvel. You know, I have followed his career for a long time. I really liked the Guardians movies. They really speak to me. They meant a lot to me. I liked a lot of his other movies. I want to see him succeed because he's a great filmmaker. He seems to be a really terrific guy, and he got fucking screwed here over some bullshit. Like, that's why I want to see him do good under any circumstances. But, like, Suicide Squad 2, yeah, I want it to be good because I want movies to be good. I'm not invested in, oh, yeah, the power is shifting to DC versus Marvel. Maybe, you know, look, it's good for my business, you know, because there's lots of articles to write about that and videos to make about, you know, Hollywood power structures moving around, and is this the sea change? Is this the point where we've had a decade where Marvel has been like the top dog, and it may or may not be capped off this coming year if Black Panther does become the first superhero movie to be nominated for Best Picture. You know, that could be a thing that happens, but then are we going to slide into a decade of, okay, Marvel had its thing, and they made a couple of bad moves with James Gunn coming here, and eventually one of these movies has to not work. You know, the original Avengers are retiring, so maybe the new crop isn't going to be as exciting for people, and it's going to shift over, and now we're going to be in the period where DC is on top for a while. Like, that's sort of interesting, you know, like an article writing, video making perspective, but I'm not invested. Like, it's not gonna power me up in the morning to wake up and find out that, like, DC's stock has risen a little bit or something. Fuck that shit. You know, don't go out into the world wearing, like, your fandom like it's your goddamn gang colors or something. I mean, don't wear gang colors in general anyway, but, like, if you're gonna do it over, like, some real shit, not over which movie studio you think makes the best fucking superhero movies. Jesus Christ. So to the degree that I find the spectacle of it amusing, sure, you know, there's this super angry contingent of DC fandom that's bought really hard into the idea of that philosophical artistic difference between the two comic book movie universes, and, you know, it's odd that got stirred in with the political thing, where the DCEU hardcore fandom was an alt-right thing because Marvel was SJW, which is weird because I'm not sure when exactly that whole thing happened, but it absolutely did on, like, the social media. So I'm not saying if you like the DC movies, you're a Republican or something, but, like, there's an edge to that where, like, if the same people who, like, jump on your ass about, like, the Snyder Cut on social media, if you scroll the timeline long enough, you're gonna find shit about, like, you're gonna find, like, the NPC shit, or the MAGA shit, or the Trump shit, or what. You're just gonna get it in there. You know, Ayn Rand shit, 4chan stuff. That seems to be the angle, and I'm not sure, you know, it's very likely probably a lot like the Gamergate, Comicsgate stuff, where you had, like, you know, organized alt-right guys looking at you know, angry nerd situations and saying, hey, here's a place where we can jump in and act like we're on the side of something and then see if anyone wants to come along and get red-pilled or whatever the bullshit terminology is this month. But yeah, you know, in case you didn't hear, Marvel is SJW because people talked about racism in a movie called Black Panther, and Brie Larson said a thing, and probably some shit about Disneyland having a Pride Day or something, so they hate everything about the so-called Marvel aesthetic, and now the main architect of a bunch of the stuff they've been pretending to shit on for years about jokes and pop songs and dance-offs and comedy is getting brought in to fix one of their franchises because the first one made money, but it was terrible. Like, watching people who do give a shit about stupid fanboy tribalism have to parse that is funny as hell. Oh man, I fucking hate the Marvel movies, I hate the Guardians movies with their dance-offs and turd jokes, and fuck James Gunn, I'm glad they got that guy out of there. I'm gonna pretend to believe all that stupid pedophile stuff because some, you know, has-been comic book artist with a YouTube channel said I should pretend to believe that, yeah, and then James Gunn's gonna do Suicide Squad 2. Oh shit, I guess I like him now. Or I hate Suicide Squad 2. Or I don't know. Tell me what to think, internet. Tell me what to think. Like, watching morons do that is funny to me, but that's the extent of which I care. Otherwise, fuck it. I hope James Gunn gets paid, and I hope Suicide Squad 2 is good. Otherwise, the important thing is that even though Disney is apparently going to stand by their ignorant, short-sighted decision to fire him in the first place, at least one studio, and plenty of others probably, aren't going to make this incredibly talented and bankable filmmaker a pariah over dumb bullshit that doesn't matter, and only stupid people and cynical Nazi bastards pretending to care about it actually care about it. Now, do I wish it had worked out another way, and that he was going to do Guardians 3 instead? Yes, yeah, I like those movies. I'd like another one. I'm nominally invested in those characters and that story, even though, no, I don't know this particular filmmaker personally. At the point where you care more about the well-being of fictional people than the real ones is the point where your priorities are out of step, period. So this isn't, at this point, a win for me or what I wanted, but it's a win for the person who was wronged, and that's what matters as far as I'm concerned. Now, will he make a good movie out of it? I mean, probably. He's a good writer and director, assuming he also directs it. It feels like he probably will. If they let him do what he wants and recognize that they probably just need to ignore as much of the last one as possible and trust a good filmmaker to make a good film, we'll get a good film. I feel like speculating on what the James Gunn version of Suicide Squad would be at this point is otherwise kind of pointless, because the only point of reference anyone would have is Guardians of the Galaxy, and his version of that was a radical departure from the script he started from and any prior iteration of the property. So who can say here? Script he started from because he did not write the original script that Marvel bought to start the Guardians of the Galaxy, the first movie. He rewrote entirely a draft that had originally been written by Nicole Perlman, and then he wrote Guardians 2 originally on his own. I assume you can bet Margot Robbie will come back as Harley Quinn if she wants to, because she's the only thing that people seem to be way into from the first one, and Warner Brothers is putting her in pretty much whatever the hell she wants, because her Harley Quinn is pretty much the only thing outside Wonder Woman that everyone seemed to agree was good in the now basically aborted and scrapped version 1 incarnation of the DC Extended Universe franchise. I mean, I think people really need to cue in on this with all of these announcements, is that we don't know what the DC Extended Universe looks like pretty much after Aquaman. And even then, we don't know fully what Aquaman is until it comes out. That longer trailer that they've released, that 5-minute long big preview clip of Aquaman, that's basically looks like a second longer trailer that has 2 big action scenes kind of cut into it, that I thought just looked the fucking balls. That's what they showed us at San Diego Comic-Con this past year, over the summer. And that was part of, I think that was the first thing that they showed. And that was part of what made that, plus the footage from Wonder Woman 1984, plus Shazam, and the general attitude of what was on stage, and also not talking about Batman or Superman at all, not talking about the other movies, not talking up connections and whatnot, no mention of Snyder Cuts, Justice League, anything like that, no talk about the Flash and the Cyborg movie, which some people seem to think is still happening. I mean, come on. And it really did feel like they could not have made it more clear in the room at that point that the prior version of the DCEU, everything up to Justice League other than Wonder Woman, was gone, over, dead. We're starting over. We're just rebuilding, whole thing getting rebuilt. And this was before we knew that Henry Cavill not coming back as Superman and Ben Affleck probably not coming back as Batman. Like, they could not have been more clear that the Mark I DCU was over if they had put a film can marked the Snyder Cut up on stage and then ritually burned it in front of the audience. Like, the only way they could have made it more clear, given how much comedy and sort of brighter, more jovial atmosphere was in the Wonder Woman preview. Shazam looking exactly like a big-budget version of a New Line superhero movie from, like, 1996. Like, the best thing in that trailer is that they kept the New Line logo on it, because it is being done through New Line. But that really does look like, other than the good special effects, it looks like a movie that they would have made, the version of that movie they would have made back when, like, when New Line was doing The Mask and such. You know, that kind of fun, sort of semi-grounded, we're doing this, but it's a comedy, and we're leaning into the high concept of its superhero movie, and which I think is the right idea. In any case, wandered a bit off track there. Also, Warner Brothers is just putting Margot Robbie in as many movies as she will do for them, because, I mean, have you seen her? I think, yeah, she's going to do the Barbie movie as well, because someone, again, took a look at her and took a look at the property and said, well, duh, and Mattel got the rights back to put that together. So as far as I remember, the news report was that her Barbie movie with Mattel is set up through Warner Brothers. They were going to do that as a comedy with Amy Schumer for a while. That fell through. Mattel's been trying to make that movie for, like, 50 years, and now that they've got her on it, it probably gets made. But either way, even if she doesn't do Suicide Squad 2, by that same token, she's already doing, like, 2 other movies as Harley Quinn. She's going to do Birds of Prey, and she's going to be in a Harley and Joker movie, which may or may not involve the Jared Leto version of the Joker, who may or may not be back for Suicide Squad 2. No one seems to know if Jared Leto is still employed as the Joker at Warner Brothers, because they cut him out of a bunch of Suicide Squad. There was all that business about how no one on the movie liked working with him, and Sony has him tapped for the Mobius the Living Vampire movie to be part of the Spider-Man spin-off movies, which looks like they're probably going to try and do now, because a whole bunch of you went out and actually saw Venom, and that's making money, so Sony is going to feel emboldened, and they're probably going to, shit out that Craven movie and the Mobius movie, and, make a whole bunch of these. We're going to get several more bad movies about Spider-Man villains. I get, this is the world now. This is the world. So they're probably going to make that Mobius movie because, hey, Venom made money and this one has a vampire in it, and Jared Leto's got photos of somebody, because that dude still keeps getting employed despite being, Jared Leto. So in any case, it's possible that Harley Quinn doesn't come back for Suicide Squad 2, that they take this in a literal whole other direction, and maybe it's more like the Suicide Squad of the comics, where they're not necessarily A-list bad guys. Maybe they get other villains. Maybe this turns into another thing. I would still expect that they would find a way for Harley Quinn at least to be in there. I imagine Will Smith will be back if Margot Robbie wants Will Smith to be back. People don't seem to remember this from the previous movie, is that Will Smith was pretty much in that movie, because sometimes when you hire Margot Robbie, you get Will Smith. He just kind of comes with that package now. His business is interesting. So yeah, who knows? James Gunn's Suicide Squad could be a completely new team, completely new concept. They said it's going to be a completely new concept. I want to see what it is. People will probably imagine that it'll be just like Guardians. People will try to figure out, oh, this character is the Drax, this character is the Star-Lord. I'm pretty sure he can do more than one kind of movie. Ironically, in many ways, Suicide Squad, the first one, is closer to the sort of movie he was doing and that he was known for before making Guardians, this kind of, like edgy, explicit trauma sort of thing. So maybe we get some of that energy. Maybe he kind of goes back to that well. Even if he'd never made Guardians of the Galaxy, the prospect of a Suicide Squad movie, written and directed, possibly directed by the guy who wrote, like, Tromeo and, who, helped to write Tromeo and Juliet, and, Slither, and, wrote and directed Super. That's pretty great. So, I'm looking forward to it, yeah. That, of course, leaves open the question of what will or should happen to Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which, believe it or not, is a more complicated issue now that he's probably not going to come back and direct it than if he did, because even if he stays fired, because of how his deal was arranged, Disney still has to pay James Gunn, and the negotiations they've been going through, hence the total silence from the primary parties involved, one would imagine, have mostly been about how much they've got to pay him. See, they rather pointedly did not fire him for having breached his contract, because he didn't breach his contract, because telling bad jokes on Twitter years ago and having people pretend to be upset about them later because you said mean things about their friend Donald Trump is not something that would have been included in a contract, because that's stupid. So they've got to pay him for at least some of the work he already did on the project. Specifically, how much do they owe him if they keep that script? Since even if there were rewrites, as is the case with most screenplays, he wasn't an active part of shooting or edited the film, it effectively means from a certain perspective that he was fired as director but remained employed as the writer, which is kind of weird, right? But that's the business. Now, they're either going to use that script, give him the screen credit, or they're not. Now, if it's not, and they don't, fuck it, all bets are off. Anything could happen. Who knows who from the cast stays on? Who knows if they even make the movie at that point? That becomes a mess. If they are going to keep the script, which feels like the more likely scenario, honestly, then the radio silence starts to make more sense. So you have to remember, the firing was real, and the sticking with it is real, because Hollywood executive ego inertia is real, but the controversy was always fake. There never was any actual Me Too or Time's Up blowback on James Gunn or the Guardians movies or those fucking tweets in any meaningful capacity. It was a gang of right-wing trolls pretending to be offended and faking blow-up because they didn't like his politics. This wasn't something anyone who, matters ever gave a shit about in the real world. So while rehiring him was apparently a non-starter on the corporate side because seemingly either one or more executives didn't want him around to start with or didn't want to be seen as admitting a mistake, there would have been no big stir about it. Like, normal people never cared one way or another, and even the pack of jackals who started this business have mostly moved on to bullying other people. These are guys who moved on from James Gunn a while ago. They just spent the last couple weeks getting that gropey drunk bastard onto the Supreme Court, and now I imagine they're going to refocus efforts onto shitting all over Elizabeth Warren, I think. The people who are still dedicated to being upset about this are overwhelmingly on the pro-rehire James Gunn side, and whatever version of someone else is going to direct Guardians 3 or Guardians 3 just isn't happening is eventually a reality. They're the ones who are going to raise hell and be a certain amount of bad PR about it. If you're Disney, that's what you're looking to avoid, and that's why any version of a deal to keep James Gunn's script would include him not talking down the eventual production or giving it some kind of blessing in the press to the fans, whatever. That's how I would imagine it happens. Which is a shitty thing to ask, but probably something that does happen because it's the business. More importantly, if and when they do get a hey, these things happen, it's okay, don't take it out on the movie, I'm good with the people who are going to finish it from James Gunn, then it becomes no longer a third rail for good directors to openly look at taking the project on, and they can find a good person to hopefully pull off a good enough third installment. And yeah, that's what I've got to say and speculate and think about all of that.
And now at last, Aquaman, a film I saw 2 weeks prior to the recording of this review, and which is either the best bad movie or the worst good movie of 2018. And before everyone gets mad and sends the DCEU fanboy army after me, relax. The point is, I had a hell of a great time watching it, and I think you will as well. I'm just not entirely sure I was supposed to for the reasons I did, and whether or not that matters anymore. You see, by any reasonable traditional metric, Aquaman should be a complete disaster. The plot is needlessly overcomplicated, but the story is embarrassingly simplistic. The thematic through line running between both is utterly confused as to what it seems to think it's about. The actual narrative doesn't make a lick of sense, and the whole of it has to be carried by Jason Momoa, who as an actor is a very strong swimmer, but he does have a lot of charisma. It has about 5 Lord of the Rings, 3 mummies, and a Dune's worth of backstory and mythology, all setting up a plot that just breaks down to bad man, want do bad thing, find magic weapons, stop him now, changes tone and speed up random between very expensive pirate movie, very expensive Kamen Rider movie, very expensive Stephen Chow comedy, bizarrely self-serious and also expensive underwater Masters of the Universe, complete with Dolph Lundgren for some reason, very expensive gender-flipped Little Mermaid, even more expensive Star Wars prequel, but it mostly settles on trying to smash Moana, Thor, and Black Panther, but where Killmonger is the good guy, into one movie, and then being even less coherent than that sound. It's the sort of movie where the very dramatic build-up to the one-on-one brother versus brother gladiator match to the death for the fate of everything cuts away to make sure that you know the drums are being played by a giant octopus, or where multiple very talented award-winning actors of stage and screen repeat very long paragraphs that all begin with "as you know," but for the benefit of the audience expository dialogue, while wearing shiny armor and riding CGI sharks, or where scenes of domestic idol
or interrupted by Nicole Kidman fighting goons in plastic Power Ranger armor with a giant fork. Or where no less than 2 characters demonstrate their powers by punching submarines, or where the villains wield magic rifles that convert water into lasers as primary weapons, or where you find yourself gradually during a very important scene thinking, okay, so are those 2 big jellyfish just holding up their princess dress, or, oh, okay, no, she's wearing a giant jellyfish, or possibly several shaped like a dress. Alright, but the thing is, being this much of an absurd, dumb mess of a thing kind of works for it, both in a go big or go home way, and in a more general what the hell else were they supposed to do, it's an Aquaman movie kind of way. The best comparison I can really think of is the 80s Flash Gordon, which I know feels like a really obvious cheap reference for my generation, but in this case it really fits in that they're both weirdly trying to keep as much of the old-fashioned pop art nonsense aspect of a dated property preserved, while also totally reinventing the main character into a modern present-day sensibility, i.e. Momoa's Arthur Curry is ostensibly a regular, down-to-earth biker surfer, let's pound some beers bro, who wants no part of the royal lineage his half-Atlantean heritage entitles him to, but must reluctantly embrace in his own way to stop Wilson from doing the badness and blah blah, you get the idea. Now that kind of King Ralph, but he's a badass and also Aquaman angle is pretty decent actually, and the best workaround for a franchise that's been saddled with having to start from Zack Snyder and Joss Whedon's Justice League conception of the character, and Momoa being something of a limited but enthusiastic instrument as a performer, and a lot of the time it works out in all of their favors. Other times, too many really, it ends up undercut by jarring changes in tone and style that feel a lot like the amount of pre-visualization involved in a movie with this many absurdly expensive CGI sequences resulted in things being done too much out of order without communication. When the plot and the character are leaning hard on the personal stuff about him resenting this magical kingdom of shiny aristocrat fish people who think they're better than him and all of the implicit thematic stuff that carries with it, he and the film are actually at their best dramatically. When it's about literally anything else, they're not, and it's back to relying on the spectacle, which is pretty damn spectacular actually. There's nothing in here that packs the instantly iconic people will remember this forever wallop, or the thematic resonance of the beach battle or No Man's Land sequence from Wonder Woman, but on balance, Aquaman is far and away the best looking DC movie, and the most unabashedly unashamed of itself, at least visually, comic book movie in a long time, at least in live action anyway. Obviously, Into the Spider-Verse is eating everyone else's lunch in that department on the broader scale. But in spite of itself, Aquaman kind of works, even when it doesn't. It's incredibly well directed by James Wan, so it all looks gorgeous, the action is coherent and engaging even when the plot isn't. Momoa has charisma to burn, and the film mostly knows what to do with him, i.e. always have Amber Heard, Willem Dafoe, Morrison, Wilson, someone else with significantly greater range in the scene to do the heavier lifting, and even if it's all patently absurd and frequently kind of dumb, magic water lasers, giant seahorses, fish people, 7 different high-tech underwater cities, giant undersea dogfights between submarines and people riding armored seahorses, big sea monsters. It's fearlessly nutty in the way this stuff should be, and if they do another one and actually find a story worth telling with these gorgeous visuals and this very compelling and weirdly eclectic cast, they might really have something. As is, Aquaman is a big, silly, ridiculous comic book movie that's a little too long and almost a little too silly, but it works. I had a lot of fun with it. It's just crazy, nutty, sea monster, mermaid, fish laser spectacle, and I kind of had a ball with it. So yeah, I'm going to say 3 stars. What else did you want Aquaman to be? Well, for reasons unplanned, but I guess foreseeable because the immutability of time and such, this episode is going up on the day of Christmas Eve, which is significant only in the sense that if you're watching this at any point after 5 or 6 p.m., you're free to imagine just how eggnog drunk I already am and how many times my brother has restarted the Blu-ray of Christmas Vacation.
Hallelujah! Holy shit! Where's the Tylenol?
I'm told that this is a time when people who don't do 4 or 5 complete web shows a week just to stay afloat get introspective about the year they left behind, but given my audience's utterly ravenous desire for content having completely obliterated my sense of time and space, I don't know that I'd be any good at that kind of thing anymore. Then again, I can say that this year has brought at least one significant shift in my life, and that's been getting called back into service by making this show a thing again.
Nobody knows that terrain better than you do. The risk factor is very high. You interested?
Do we get to win this time?
and also another show, and another show, because like the mighty goldfish, I will pretty much grow to the size of my environment, and like a Smurf infestation, you can't really ever get rid of me once I'm in the home. Looking back, has it been a learning experience? I don't necessarily know. I've definitely picked up a lot of new information, but is that really a learning experience? If you can't say for sure you've actually learned anything from it yet, seems like the jury might still be out. Working in, around, and adjacent to geek and gamer culture means trying to stay simultaneously abreast of not only what's popular on the fringe, but also what's mainstream popular but used to be fringe and therefore somehow still fringe, and how to tell the difference, to say nothing of now several successive generations worth of nostalgia, perhaps typified by the Russian nesting doll of monomythological daddy issues that now constitutes every discussion about, say, Star Wars. It's become difficult to not wonder if this kind of job is somewhat a waste of time, not necessarily mine. I mean, I'm getting paid for this, and getting to step back into this particular role and this particular website is immensely satisfying for the implicit I win suckers to festering corners of the internet that for some baffling reason managed to convince themselves they had something to do with my short-lived absence. I mean more on the lines of whether or not there's anything I could be doing that's more important than browsing about movies and video games, reminding people of bizarre things that existed a few years ago, or informing them of even more bizarre things they might not have known existed in the first place. I mean, you know, what with destabilization of the post-war liberal order, looming environmental collapse aided and abetted by a willing disregard for even the concept of intellectual self-improvement prevailing among humanity, and the overall general realization that life in the 21st century is going to be absolutely nothing like the bright and relatively hopeful future I'd grown up looking forward to and working toward, and I get just a little bit angrier and more resentful about it every day. But then I always said that the speed at which information moves and popular culture turns over meant that my generation was not only going to get intellectually old before our time, which happened, certainly, but that the metric hadn't yet been invented to calculate how grouchy and bitter we were going to be when we actually got old. So it's possible that this is all rather appropriate, and that there's nothing new under the sun except the record-setting temperatures under the sun. And while it hasn't been easy settling back into the groove of covering the angles of the great pop culture maelstrom, one thing that has been encouraging to be reminded of is that despondency arrives so readily, not because it's abundant, but because it's easy. So even though for any number of reasons I can't say I've had a spectacularly happy year, I can say there has been light in the dark, reasons to hope and hold on, and while none of them are as important as friends, family, and the cultivation of mental health, a lot of them have indeed come from the realm of seemingly meaningless disposable bric-a-brac that constitutes the lifeblood of this show and the other stuff that I do. I got to see Simon Belmont in a Smash Brothers game, which in turn meant I got to see Captain N re-enter the cultural discussion, if only for a moment. I got to see an honest-to-God awesome movie made out of a video game in Rampage, and I got the schadenfreude of having it come from an arcade classic instead of a fancy billion-dollar AAA flavor of the year. That was definitely satisfying. Oh, come on, you're gonna have plenty of opportunity to be mad at The Rock for substantive reasons when he's president. For now, it's okay to enjoy the movies. Speaking of things that are more substantive, few things have been better for the sense of maybe what we do actually matters than seeing all those families in group costumes and classrooms full of kids pouring out in record numbers for Black Panther back in February, and all the cultural praise and award season love being poured out on that, and the equally groundbreaking Into the Spider-Verse more recently. Covering the fluctuating nuances of nerd culture can be not only exhausting, but also ugly. Particularly on the fandom side, it's easy to get beaten down by the worst of things like douchebags destroying a McDonald's over a Rick and Morty joke they didn't even understand, or comic book has-beens shaking the crowdfunding cup for the alt-right, or Disney getting tricked into firing James Gunn and then digging in their heels over it rather than admitting they got played by internet morons. And it's easy to want to retreat into the comforting cynicism of seeing all of this as just being hopelessly tainted by the commercialism and corporatism at the core of it. You know, maybe the jerks and smart Alex and holier-than-thou podcast creeps are right about even trying to find meaning or value in this stuff, because it's all just so much late capitalism distraction from the important things. But then I see stuff like those movies, and The Last Jedi for that matter, and the Lego movies, and the Reborn Mystery Science Theater, and hell, there's even a good Transformers movie now of all things. Stuff that's showing how you can take the junky, weird mishmash of stuff that we decided constituted a modern, postmodern, maybe culture, and remix it into meaningful, thoughtful things that can speak to people and affect them, and, you know, maybe even remake the world in small, positive ways. And that's good to see. That is encouraging. And if I can be somehow maybe like a microscopic part of that here in my tiny little corner going, hey, you guys remember Snailians? Snailians were a thing? Well, you know, that's just fine. Here's to 2019 being a better one, and this ramble somehow making sense in the editing. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture. Well, James Gunn has been rehired by Walt Disney and Marvel Studios to resume writing and directing Guardians of the Galaxy 3 as originally planned. The news arrives on the same weekend that Captain Marvel is set to easily sail past 200 million domestic or something close, or actually a little bit over. Well on track to doing basically about as well as every other solo Marvel movie in spite of a supposedly massive boycott seemingly organized by the same nebulous blob of internet hobgoblins that worked to get Gunn removed in the first place. In fact, depending on which reporting you read, the deal to get this done was apparently made months ago behind the scenes, got drawn out long enough so as to not make trouble with the pending Disney-Fox acquisitions, ultimately creating a window of time in which Gunn was able to commit to rebooting Suicide Squad for Warner Brothers and DC as well, so good job on that boycott, boys. Cheers. In all seriousness, I'm absolutely thrilled. I love the Guardians movies. I've always been a huge fan of James Gunn. I think this is it's just great. This is great news. I'm thrilled beyond belief. I'm really glad for all of the other fans. I'm glad that the movie will come out. I'm glad for the cast that really came out and put their shit on the line for this. I think this is the first really good bit of news like this that's happened in quite a while surrounding this whole thing. I'm also a little bit disappointed in myself because over the last 2 months or so, I had honestly begun to believe that the hopes of this working out in the right way were pretty much over, that he wasn't going to get brought back on, that taking over Suicide Squad instead basically confirmed that this was not a thing that was going to happen. But now if you go back and look at my earlier videos on the subject, back when this was a regular weekly show because I hadn't revived the big picture yet on The Escapist, which has now been going on for a few months, and look at how it seems to have played out instead, it looks like I should have stuck to my guns, please pardon the unintended but also unavoidable pun, because it sounded like my early impressions of how things were playing out were much more correct than when I started to lose hope about it. See, what never made full sense about any of this is why the situation seemed to get out of control so fast. This is Disney and Marvel, the most well-oiled machine at Disney. They don't do not in control. When Edgar Wright had to bow out of Ant-Man at what felt like the last minute, they found not only a new director, but a fairly noteworthy new director who could also knock together a mostly new script and new scenes pretty much right away. This was a much bigger, much more elaborate production. Why weren't they taking meetings right the hell away like they need to be? Plus, there was the fact that his brother Sean Gunn, who plays Kraglin and doubles for Rocket on the shooting days, wasn't leaving the company either. The fact that the actors were all out in force making a public declaration saying they wanted him back and not facing blowback from the studio for doing so. None of the prominent journalists and critics who shared around the Rehire James Gunn hashtag, like myself, caught any publicist or studio PR pushback of it that I knew of. And Gunn himself didn't come out and ask anyone to say anything one way or another, not a show of appreciation for support, request for fans to tone it down or whatnot. That was strange either way. And there was all the very public stuff about which producers did or didn't agree with bringing him back on, and the fact that everyone knew openly that he'd had meetings with Alan Horn, the guy who'd originally done the firings, supposedly over the objections of Kevin Feige and others, and that there was even more public open debate about whether or not to still use his script. See, inside baseball stuff here, but the whole wasn't really fired thing is kind of really important, but also not important at all, depending on how you look at it. You see, Hollywood is a union town, and that means that it runs on paperwork. So when they say someone's been fired, not officially been fired, using a script, not using a script, it's mainly an issue of what's been signed off on and whose agent has said yes or no, that kind of thing. Basically, until they got someone else on to direct the movie, they wouldn't have necessarily said, okay, he's officially off of the movie. So that is more or less what the James Gunn was never actually fired thing would have been about. See also the are we going to use his script or not, because literally they would have had to still credit him depending on what percentage they use, specific lines, specific pages. They don't fuck around with this stuff. This is why there's still a credited screenwriter on the first Guardians of the Galaxy, even though James Gunn rewrote pretty much the entire script, like from the ground up. So basically all of the signs from where I was sitting pointed to they're trying to get him back on, but they're also trying to finesse it so that no one had to be the bad guy, or at least look like the bad guy, because everyone wanted to save face, and that's what I said was probably going on, at least is what I hoped was going on, and that was why the fans should keep the pressure on Disney to help it go that way, and now it seems like that was what was going on, and if I'd stayed with my original prediction and not looked at the Suicide Squad development as likely meaning everyone was moving on, I would have looked like a goddamn predictive genius right about now. Oh well. Of course now, speaking of predictive, because everyone loves conspiracies, like this bullshit about how no one's actually going to see Captain Marvel, Disney's just buying all the theater seats, we'll touch on all that idiocy in a bit. There's now this whole take that this means he was never actually fired, and that none of the controversy was ever a controversy, it was all a plan right from the beginning because Disney knew they had to make it look good because of Me Too, which this never had any connection to, but you know that. So everything from Gunn pretending to walk away like he'd been fired, to the actors complaining, to the rehire hashtag, it was a big work like pro wrestling because they needed the Fox deal to go right, and now that the Fox deal has gone right, or it's about to go right as of this recording, they can finish that angle and go back to work. So obviously no one is going to know what really happened in full detail for a long time, if ever, but to me, the fact that the Suicide Squad gig happened at all and is still moving forward before he goes back to work on Guardians 3, which, remember, was heading into production ready to go and had to be shut down and had its crew dismissed when this all happened, tells me that this was at least partly real and in flux for a while during that 8 months that this shit show was playing out. But if James Gunn wasn't at least a little bit on the outs with some of the company, it's hard to imagine Disney letting a valuable asset take time away to work with another studio, hell, not just another studio, but a direct box office genre competitor. That's just wacky. So the idea that this was a work from the beginning, that's stupid. That's stupid even for a Marvel Disney YouTube clickbait conspiracy theory, and those are really fucking stupid.
Wow! You're an idiot!
But has it been a work for, say, the last couple months when we just stopped hearing about this altogether, even from Dave Bautista, who famously doesn't give two shits about pissing off studio executives by going off script if he feels like it? Yeah, it probably has been. Again, we might never know what went down or if we do the exact timeline of events, but if I had to hazard a guess, from what we do know, I still maintain that it's likely the initial fire him right away power move by Alan Horn And just to reiterate, in case you're coming to this somewhat fresh, or you forgot, or you're in denial somehow, there never was a sustained, legitimate, organic social justice outrage by actual, legitimately outraged, authentically offended, real normal people against James Gunn's stupid Twitter jokes from years ago. It was a fake internet alt-right chanter thing whipped up by Mike Cernovich, specifically targeting Gunn because he'd been a vocal critic of the Trump administration and because their dumb, culty collective was pissy about Roseanne getting bounced from her show for doing a racism on Twitter, and they wanted to take out a progressive celebrity in, by their twisted logic, the same fashion. Ahem. So I think Alan Horn originally firing Gunn was probably the real deal, but the immediacy of the blowback, I don't think they were expecting at all. I mean, it happened all at once, it was sustained, the actors joined in, the other talent joined in, basically zero prominent voices came out and said good call, and especially early on before they retook control of their own media narrative, the reports about Kevin Feige being immediately against it and going hard to pull it back together were kinda everywhere. So even if he wasn't, somebody wanted to be thought that he was. Cutting to the chase, from where I sit, the version that makes the most sense is that the firing was real, the vague internal power move struggle over at Disney execs versus Marvel execs was real. They did resolve it relatively quickly, but then sat on it because, like I said originally, nobody wanted to have it play out where anyone would look like a bad guy or in the wrong, even if Disney was totally in the wrong, and because it was best to leave all the uncertainties for after the Fox deal went through, because it took that long, and because he's not stupid, somewhere in that limbo zone is where the Suicide Squad deal happened, because hey, a man's gotta eat, right? And also it can't hurt to remind Disney that you do have options, sure. But this idea people are throwing around now that this entire thing was this elaborate, gamed-out, five-dimensional chess master plan to make it look like Marvel did a virtue signal or something. I mean, come on, seriously? Forget that it doesn't make any sense. Think about the logistics that are being suggested by that. This is a conspiracy that assumes that in the less than 24-hour time frame it took for a relatively small number of alt-right trolls to spread a meme around Twitter that it got nominal media coverage. The entire corporate structure in charge of the Disney Marvel apparatus managing not only Guardians 3 but also Infinity War and the other adjacent productions. That would mean Kevin Feige, Alan Horn, Bob Iger, all the executive and associate producers below them, the trade and craftspeople unions working on the already mounted production, Disney legal, Marvel legal, everyone's individual lawyers, James Gunn himself, Sean Gunn, the Russo brothers, and their people, since Gunn is also a producer on Infinity War and Endgame, all had to immediately get on the same page and agree that the best course of action would be to pretend to fire James Gunn, have him vanish from public life for 8 whole months in order to keep the rouge up, risk sowing open division and distrust amongst some of their most loyal fans by allowing the rouge to include presumably also fake public feud between different executives within the studio and subsidiary structure and the franchise entire principal cast, all of whom would also have to be in on this, delay the actual movie at a cost of who knows how much money and scrap production budget, and a gaping familiar franchise-shaped hole in your schedule. Oh, and to help it look more real, Gunn will also write and direct a movie for your rival studio and a competing franchise, but for some reason you will not meet with any replacement director to help realism on your end, and then eventually, once everyone has effectively given up hope and moved on, you're still a week or two out from closing that deal, you were somehow worried about this causing a price hike in, then you'll drop the act and announce that he's learned his lesson and can come back. Oh, but he'll still make that Suicide Squad movie for the other guys first.
Not a great plan.
Yeah, sure, that sounds a lot less complicated and expensive than just saying, yeah, bad jokes, but he already said he was sorry about that years ago, and by the way, nobody actually cares what a bunch of Trumpy 4chan creepazoids pretend to be angry about. But then that's the thing, isn't it? None of these internet moron conspiracy theories, whether it's James Gunn, Captain Marvel's box office, SJW Marvel in general, The Last Jedi, or Comicsgate, or CalArts Animation Monopoly, or Pizzagate, or QAnon, or really any of the Disney stuff, other than the boring, obvious, this company is probably way too large and anti-competitive aspect, they're all just fucking stupid and they break down on basic logic. There's no sense to any of them of whatever the key people in charge might be trying to accomplish that would need to be accomplished in such an idiotically elaborate, counterintuitive way. I don't see a big elaborate James Gunn conspiracy either. From my vantage point, it looks like he really would have been gone baby gone had the actors, the rest of the Marvel team, and yes, the fans, not stepped up and made it overwhelmingly clear that the backlash wasn't going to die down, that the hashtag stayed in circulation, that billboard went up, and oh hey, this went down and got affected without a dumbass boycott or any harassment campaigns. How about that? All of which, honestly, mostly feels like a welcome return to some semblance of normality after several years of unbalanced nonsense, you know? Like a little bit. It's not even close to the most important thing in the world, but after 3 fucking years of reality TV presidents and internet weirdos like Steve Bannon and the WikiLeaks guy getting treated like world figures, and holy hell, just a couple days ago, the head of the Gambino crime family got whacked in like the highest New York mob killing in 30 years, and the guy who did it showed up in court with a bunch of QAnon, MAGA, internet weirdo Trump kid stuff written on his hands. I mean, goddamn. So it's sort of nice to at least be able to look at the Guardians of the Galaxy movies of all things, and I guess implicitly the future of cosmic Marvel properties in general, and James Gunn getting back on board as this island of sanity where, hey, things make sense here at least, priorities are in order, whiny internet shitgoblins don't matter and don't get to dictate anything here, relax and enjoy on balance a succession of thus far above average movies at least. Because as much as I love the Guardians movies, and as both an objective and personal level, and as much as I'm a huge fan of Gunn going all the way back to his Troma days, this was always about more than him and this franchise and Marvel and Disney. He got targeted by people who took it upon themselves themselves to act as essentially a digital vigilante mob dedicated to targeting the political enemies of the current president, a guy who routinely refers to journalists and entertainers who oppose his agenda as the enemies of the people. That's dangerous, and letting them get away with it or even feel like they've gotten away with it would have been emboldening for them to do worse to even more vulnerable people in the future. It's important that they lost. And while it is important that people were able to step up and contribute whatever small amount of extra push they did to make sure things worked out in this case, if people want to take a lesson from this and make it really count, they'll remember that this was possible and go even harder next time, and sadly there probably will be a next time, something like this happens to someone who maybe isn't as famous, didn't have the social capital or privilege that James Gunn did, didn't necessarily make something as widely loved as the Guardians movies, is a woman, LGBTQ, person of color, etc. This time, ultimately, the good guys won and the bad guys lost, and I want the good guys to keep winning, and that only happens when we all have each other's backs.
We are